We're now in public session. Today's pre-budget hearing deals with climate change issues. Actions to mitigate the causes and impacts of climate change are likely to have a significant budgetary impact on both revenue and expenditure. The focus of this committee is on the long-term budgetary implications of climate change measures. These include climate change targets and compliance costs, the budgetary impact of measures to introduce carbon taxes, and long-term changes to yield to the exchequer arising from climate change measures. Before we begin, can I please remind members and witnesses to turn off their mobile phones. The interference from phones affects the sound quality and transmission of the meeting. So I'd like to welcome representatives from the Climate Change Advisory Council, Professor John Fitzgerald, the Chair. You're very welcome. And he's accompanied by Mr. Philip O'Brien from the Secretariat. From the ESRI, I want to welcome Dr. Kelly de Broughan, Research Officer, and she's accompanied by Dr. John Curtis, Associate Research Professor. And finally, from the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment, Principal Officer Mr. Frank Maughan, and you're accompanied by Principal Officer Mr. Kevin Brady and Mr. James Code, Administration Officer. Thank you for making yourselves, all of you, available for today's meeting. Before we hear the witness's opening statement, I want to draw your attention to the position on privilege which applies to witnesses, and to advise you that by virtue of Section 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act of 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to the committee. However, if you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence on a particular matter and continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're also directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you shouldn't criticise or make charges against any person or any entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they shouldn't comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official, either by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. So I'm now going to ask each of the witnesses to make their opening statements, to be followed by questions and answers. So Professor Fitzgerald, I now invite you to make your opening statement. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. When I submitted my statement, it was before the plan was published, so I'll just say a few words on the plan. The Council welcomes the plan published yesterday as a major step forward. It includes realistic sectoral targets and appropriate governance to ensure a successful transition, or else at least early warning if we are underperforming. And instead of making optimistic assumptions about, for example, oil prices, which would reduce the magnitude of the challenges we face, the plan is more realistic, and this is to be welcomed. And the next task is to ensure that detailed measures are put forward in the plan are implemented in an appropriate timescale. In terms of the opening statement, one of the points to make is that the costs of doing too little are far greater on climate change than doing too much, so that we should err on the side of caution by doing too much, but we're actually doing too little. Ireland has set itself the binding target of decarbonising by 2050 with key milestones along the way, and the plan sets out how realistic targets for 2030. However, out to 2050, it involves a huge rate of acceleration. So if we had seen, or we saw a trajectory to 2050, we might say actually we should be trying to do even more by 2030 if we're to get to our 2050 target. That remains to be seen. Our job is to provide independent advice on the most cost-effective way of meeting our climate change goals. On carbon taxation, there's been a very wide range of research in Ireland and elsewhere showing it's essential, and the raising the cost of emitting greenhouse gases is essential if we were to halt global warming. And one of the key messages from the Council in our successive reports has been that we need to implement rising carbon taxes reflecting the potential damage done from emitting greenhouse gases if we're to make progress. The wide range of other measures and policies that are needed to bring about decarbonisation will be significantly undermined if emitting greenhouse gases remains the cheap option. The carbon tax in Ireland, the carbon tax and the carbon price in the EU emissions trading system are too low, and that is one of the factors in why we are underachieving. There are three key reasons why pricing emissions of carbon dioxide is important. It discourages use of fossil fuels, and it makes it comparatively cheaper to use electric cars, upgrade our homes, and so on. Equally, pricing emissions appropriately means that business and government will find that eliminating greenhouse gas emissions saves money. Carbon pricing, and especially the carbon tax, provides the government with revenue which it can use to compensate or support those who are on low incomes, and it can be used in the budget to reduce other taxes to increase expenditure. And research shows that shifting from taxes on labour or indirect taxes to carbon can actually increase employment. So it is what you do with the revenue can affect both the distributional effects, and it can have beneficial effects in the economy as a whole. But really the most important reason for pricing emissions is to incentivise business and households to invest in new technologies which will allow us to continue to enjoy a reasonably high standard of living while eliminating greenhouse gas emissions. And the reason why car companies, Volkswagen, aren't nice people, the reason why they're investing vast billions in developing electric cars is they know they will be priced out of the market if it doesn't happen. So it shows that it drives technological development, the expectation that prices are going to rise. The current carbon pricing levels are too low to drive real change. The carbon tax, given that we didn't do it in the last budget, probably should be raised to €35 a tonne in the next budget, with a commitment to raise it to at least €80 a tonne by 2030. And what's important is there's a trajectory, there's a commitment, and that's why this isn't just for government, it's for the Oireachtas to commit to a rising trajectory over time, so that people know if you invest in reducing emissions, you will make money in the future. There's a massive body of evidence from across the world that carbon taxes are essential. There are very few carbon tax deniers in the economics community. And a recent statement by a very large number of US economists identified this as essential for the US and for the world. And these economists included 27 Nobel Prize winners. The OECD and EU led the way in Europe in 1990 and 1992, and unfortunately Ireland rejected the proposal to raise a carbon tax in 1992 at an EU level on the basis that we didn't believe in tax harmonisation, and that was a very unwise move by Ireland at the time. And the research which the SRI did show that it would have been actually beneficial for Ireland if we had gone ahead with that EU proposal. Since 1992, there have been a very large number of papers, some of which the two colleagues from the SRI have been involved in, all of which show that carbon taxes are essential to driving the decarbonisation of the Irish economy. There's been at least one a year over a 30-year period. The Council advocates hypothecation of the revenue from carbon taxes, using it to compensate those on low incomes who might otherwise carry a disproportionate share of the additional tax burden, and promoting investment in dealing with climate change and returning the residual income to households. As long ago as 1992, an ESRI study suggested 30% of the revenue should be used to compensate those on low incomes, and many papers have considered it since. There was a very useful paper by Barrett from the ESRI last week, looking at a range of options which gives you the information that the government, the Oireachtas, needs to determine how best to carry out a just transition. While advocating a just transition approach, the Council has not favoured a particular scheme for achieving it. Detailed policies on how best to redistribute income are a matter for the government and the Oireachtas, not for an advisory group on climate policy. It is important, turning to investment in the next budget, it is important that the investment programme in Budget 2020 should be subject to rigorous assessment using the parameters of the revised Public Expenditure Code, which assumes a carbon tax, a carbon price of €260 a tonne in 2050. Using the discount rates which they recommend, that would suggest a carbon price of €80 a tonne today. So that in planning for the future, the government should be taking account of the fact that saving emissions is worth €80 a tonne today, and it could have a significant effect, for example, on the state's investment in vehicles. In planning to ramp up investment in retrofitting houses and other buildings, it would be important to take account of the capacity of the building industry to deliver, and this was issue which the plan pays particular attention to, and that is very welcome. The expertise and skills need to be developed to undertake this work, and this may take some time. However, in the plan, it does say that these investments in retrofitting houses will make sense if the carbon price is 30 euros a tonne or 80 euros a tonne, and it really emphasises that this isn't going to happen unless the carbon tax is raised, as we recommend. One way of developing this expertise would be to gradually ramp up contracts to retrofit the stock of local authority dwellings owned by the state. The state is the landlord and has the responsibility to do so. In doing so, the state would signal that investment in this sector will be a major feature of the coming decades, and developing the building industry capacity and skills to deliver it would be worthwhile. This investment would also substantially reduce emissions from families in local authority dwellings, many of them low incomes. It would substantially reduce their expenditure, benefiting them in other ways, and in the case of more elderly tenants, it would bring significant health benefits. In conclusion, carbon pricing alone will not deliver the necessary emissions reductions, but delivering emissions reductions without a sufficient carbon price would be almost impossible and certainly more expensive. Increasing the cost of emitting carbon is not a once-off commitment, but must be sustained over the coming decade. Thank you.
Professor, now call on Dr. de Broughan to make your opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me begin by thanking the Chair for the invitation to appear before you today. I am Kelly de Broughan, Head of the Climate Economy Modelling Team at the ESRI, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. John Curtis. This committee is considering the budgetary implications of issues relating to climate change. The specific design of a climate policy will have ramifications for its environmental, economic, distributional and budgetary impacts. It is critical that these policies are well designed to ensure emissions reduction and minimize the economic disruption and be distributionally fair, whereby those most able to bear the cost do so. In this opening statement, I wish to give you an outline of the current work being conducted at the ESRI on the Irish carbon tax and convey our results concerning this issue. Our goal is to provide insights into the impacts of increasing the Irish carbon tax to guide policy formation. In what follows, I will focus on results concerning the increased revenues resulting from carbon tax increase, the impacts on emissions, macroeconomic impacts, and distributional impacts across both production sectors and households. To contextualize our results, a general understanding of our methods is useful. Hence, I will first give a short, non-technical overview of our model. The Ireland Environment, Energy and Economy, I3E model, has recently been developed by myself and Dr. Yakut. It examines the relationship between the economy, energy use and emissions of greenhouse gases. In technical terms, it's a macroeconomic, intertemporal, computable general equilibrium model. It reproduces the structure of the economy in its entirety. It includes 32 distinct production sectors, 37 different goods, 10 different household types, 3 different labour types, trade and the government, among others. It's a dynamic model that incorporates economic growth over the modelling horizon, which runs from 2014 to 2050. In the model, the nature of all existing economic transactions among the diverse economic agents is quantified. In other words, it examines how inputs and outputs flow between production sectors in the Irish economy and finally result in final goods consumed by the households. The I3E model includes energy flows as well as emissions in addition to the standard monetary flows. Each production sector produces an economic commodity using labour, capital and material inputs and energy inputs. The I3E model explicitly comprises a set of carbon commodities, including peat, coal, natural gas, crude oil, fuel oil, LPG, gasoline, diesel, kerosene, and other petroleum products. Based on the relative prices, producers can change their production inputs to minimize costs. Similarly, consumers can change their consumption patterns based on relative costs to maximize their utility. The explicit modeling of intersectoral linkages makes it possible to investigate the wider economic implications of a specific policy such as a carbon tax through the different transmission channels in the economy. We examined the impacts of an increase of a carbon tax of €10 in 2020 with further increases of €5 a year, reaching a carbon tax of €80 in 2030. I will first focus on the case where the carbon tax revenues are used to reduce government debt. after which I will discuss our investigation of different revenue recycling schemes to understand how carbon tax revenue can be used to limit both the economic and distributional impacts of this carbon tax increase. Increasing the carbon tax by €10 in 2020 would increase expected carbon tax revenues from €257 million to €666 million in 2020. Additional increments in the tax would result in carbon tax revenue increases from $682 million to $2,138 million in 2030. However, when this carbon tax revenue is not recycled but used to reduce government debt, our model shows that revenue impacts are likely to be negative, where large decreases in the receipts of sale taxes, wage taxes and corporate taxes due to decreased economic output and consumption outweigh the increase in carbon tax receipts. Household emissions are estimated to decrease by, on average, 10% in 2030 compared to a no increase in carbon tax. These results are in line with other ESRI work, which develops a behavioral microsimulation model and econometrically estimates the behavioral response of households to a carbon tax increase in terms of direct carbon emissions. We also find that rural households reduce their emissions substantially more than urban households. Economy-wide emissions in 2030 are estimated to be 15% less with the carbon tax increase than without it. However, over time, emissions still increase, where 2030 emissions are almost 27% higher than 2018 emissions. Our model is likely to underestimate emission reduction somewhat, as we do not explicitly include new technologies in the model. However, it is clear that in the absence of other climate policies, the carbon tax would need to be significantly higher to reach the Irish EU emission goals. Real GDP will be lowered by 0.3% in 2020 compared to no increase in the tax, and by 0.6% in 2030. Wages will decrease where low-skilled labour is most impacted. The most impacted production sectors are transport, mining and electricity, with value-added reductions of up to 2.7% compared to a situation where there is no increase in the carbon tax. Comparing impacts across household, we find a strong regressive trend where poorer households are impacted the most in terms of disposable income, consumption, price increases and welfare. In terms of welfare, rural households are impacted more than urban. This is in line with Tovarianos and Lynch, as well as other ESRI work, which applies the ESRI's tax and benefit microsimulation switch model, which replicates the tax and benefit system of Ireland in a high level of detail. The I3E model, however, finds higher impacts as it includes secondary impacts such as price changes to non-carbon goods, microeconomic impacts, and household impacts via wage and capital income. A major concern of the carbon tax is that it is often regressive in nature, and we see the same in Ireland. Distributing carbon tax revenues to households is often proposed as an effective way of reducing the regressive aspects of a carbon tax. We examined two different transfer schemes. In the first, carbon tax revenues are given back to households on a per capita basis. In the second, revenues are distributed based on the relative current welfare transfers. In terms of real disposable income, a lump sum transfer will significantly decrease the regressive trend of the tax, where there are positive impacts for rural households and negative impacts for urban households. Applying a social welfare-based transfer, we find that to a lesser degree decrease in regressiveness. Both Tovarianos and Lynch and Birchall's and Roundtree find such transfers to have higher impacts on reducing regressive trends. Our results show that the secondary impacts not included in that work are predominantly regressive in nature, causing a less regressive impact. Real GDP impacts remain negative, but are almost halved as compared to when revenue is used to reduce government debt. When applying social welfare transfers or lump sum transfers, net government revenue is estimated to increase by approximately €500 million in 2020. It is often suggested that revenues from an environmental tax can be recycled to create a so-called double dividend, where other distortionary taxes can be reduced, boosting economic growth, while at the same time achieving emission reductions. We investigate various revenue recycling schemes and their impacts on the economy, as well as their distributional impacts across households. Our results show that when carbon tax revenue is used to reduce other distortionary taxes in the economy, a double dividend can be achieved. Decreasing wage taxes, sales taxes, or corporate taxes will result in an increase in GDP of up to 0.8% compared to a no change in carbon tax, while still achieving significant emission reductions. Impacts on households will be positive, but there will be higher impacts on richer households. Value added in most sectors is boosted, and value added reductions are limited in the carbon tax sensitive sectors, with the exception of transport. When carbon revenue is used to reduce sales tax, this will increase wage and corporate tax receipts due to increased consumption, increasing the total government revenues by approximately €660 million in 2020. Reducing wage taxes will boost production and receipts of sales tax and corporate taxes, resulting in an approximate increase in total government revenues of €1,600 million in 2020. A reduction in corporate tax will increase receipts of wage and sales taxes, increasing total government revenues by €1,300 million and reducing more government debt than when revenues are used to directly reduce government debt. In conclusion, we find that the economic and budgetary impacts of a carbon tax will strongly depend on the specific policy design. A well-designed carbon tax revenue recycling scheme can assist in reaching other goals, such as economic growth and inequality reduction, in addition to economic emission reduction. We wish the committee every success and are happy to assist the committee in the coming months.
Thanks, Kelly. And now Mr. Carroll, I invite you to speak.
Thank you, Chair. I thank the committee for the invitation to the department to appear before it to discuss the budgetary implications of climate change and to discuss any questions the committee may have. As the committee will be aware, the government yesterday published its new climate action plan. This is a major milestone in Ireland's climate policy and represents a step change in Ireland's response to climate change. The plan sets out how Ireland will, at the very least, meet its targets for the period to 2030 and puts us on a trajectory to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050. The plan will have a strong focus on implementation, setting out over 180 actions with clear timelines and steps needed to achieve each action. The plan will follow a similar approach to the Action Plan for Jobs model, which involves annual updating of the plan with new actions, quarterly reporting on delivery, a climate action delivery board chaired by the Department of Taoiseach, holding government departments and public bodies to account, ongoing consultation and feedback informing each subsequent plan, and ongoing review of changing costs and technologies to inform new actions being developed. The goals and targets set out in the plan are informed by analysis of the most cost-effective choices currently available to reach our 2030 targets. By articulating a decarbonisation ambition range for each sector, the framework provided by the plan will enable each sector to identify and put in place the most appropriate policy tools to deliver the stated ambition in order for Ireland to meet its 2030 targets. As the committee will be aware, the objective of the Minister in finalising this plan has also been to closely follow the recommendations of the report of the Joint Committee on Climate Action, published in March of this year, which was in turn informed by the earlier work of the Citizens' Assembly. I'll now touch on the main points mentioned by the committee's letter of invitation to the department. So beginning with revenue implications of increasing the price on carbon, the government is committed to carbon pricing as a core element of the suite of measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a sustained manner over time. Ireland is one of a minority of countries globally to have already implemented economy-wide carbon pricing through its implementation of the EU emissions trading system for electricity generation and large industry, and through a national carbon tax that applies in other sectors of the economy. The Climate Action Plan, while recognising that taxation decisions are primarily a matter for the Minister for Finance, does commit the government to implementing a carbon tax rate of €80 per tonne by 2030, with a trajectory of increases over successive annual budgets. This was recommended by the Climate Change Advisory Council in its 2018 annual review and has also been broadly endorsed by the Joint Committee in its report. There is a clear rationale for both increasing the rate and for clearly signposting the desired future rate of carbon tax, as it provides a strong signal to householders and firms of the need to invest in low-carbon alternatives where possible. I won't dwell on the potential additional revenue that can be raised through carbon tax. As the committee will be aware from Tax Strategy Group analysis, each additional €5 rate of carbon tax could raise in the region of an additional €100 million per annum. The Government is, of course, concerned about the distributional implications of increasing the rate of tax, and I understand the Department of Finance is considering a number of options in relation to the use of any additional carbon tax revenue in this regard, and is currently consulting in relation to how additional revenue raised from increasing the carbon tax could be used. The ESRI has already provided some information on its detailed research programme examining both the revenue and the emissions impacts, as well as the distributional impacts of increasing carbon tax. In terms of medium-term expenditure requirements to achieve our targets, the overall quantum of capital resources available to departments and agencies is set out in the National Development Plan for the period to 2027 in the context of the Project Ireland 2040 framework. The NDP allocates approximately €30 billion in total in exchequer and non-exchequer resources to climate action and sustainable mobility resources over the decade, and the allocation of these resources to individual departments is subject to the normal estimates and budgetary process. However, achievement of the Government's climate policy objectives and the particular targets set out in the plan as published will not only rely on exchequer funding. The plan also foresees a role for taxation policy and for regulatory measures to bring about reductions in our emissions. For example, setting a long-term trajectory for the carbon tax, as I've already discussed, in order to change long-term behaviour and decision-making to encourage investment in more sustainable choices, and new regulations to end certain practices, such as phasing out oil and gas boilers in homes or banning the sale of new petrol and diesel cars from 2030. The low-carbon transition will require significant private investment alongside exchequer expenditure on a sustained basis over a number of decades. The Government will seek opportunities to leverage private finance with its exchequer funding. For example, in the first call of the Climate Action Fund, which has an overall envelope of €500 million, a €77 million commitment from the fund was able to leverage a total investment of €300 million. New Era will continue its work with commercial state companies to identify priority opportunities in key sectors to mobilise private investment towards assisting in meeting our climate objectives. The plan also envisages new ways of spending the exchequer resources that we do have, in order to maximise the impact of the €3 billion that has been allocated to home energy retrofits under the NDP. We are reforming the current system to create a new retrofit delivery model. This envisages grouping houses together, so one contractor would seek to retrofit batches of homes in the same area, developing smart finance products with low-cost financing linked to energy performance improvements, and easy payback methods where households can pay back the cost over a longer period, for example through payments through local property tax bills or through electricity bills. In terms of the cost of missing targets, Ireland is required under EU rules to reduce emissions covered by the non-ETS sector by 20% relative to 2005 levels by 2020. Current EPA projections indicate that relevant emissions could remain at between 0 and 1% below 2005 levels by 2020. The relevant legislation at EU level does allow Member States to meet their targets by means of unused emissions allowances from earlier years or through purchasing credits from other Member States or in international markets. This will mean that Ireland can remain compliant with EU rules even though our emissions will not have reduced to the mandated level by 2020. The Government has already spent approximately €120 million in total on the purchase of credits over a period between 2007 and 2009, for which approximately 8.5 million credits were received by the state. Some of these were used towards Ireland's compliance with the Kyoto Protocol first commitment period in the period 2008-2012. In terms of the cost of purchasing additional credits to meet our targets, the Department currently estimates the cost to be in the region of €6 to €13 million, depending on the price and the final quantity of allowances required. In relation to 2030 compliance, the same arrangements in relation to purchasing credits will apply under EU rules. The Government's objective, however, is to avoid having to rely on this option. In terms of other channels through which the budgetary process could assist in addressing climate change, robust rules on how we value the shadow price of carbon as part of project appraisal for all public capital investments are essential to avoiding expenditure that locks in long-term fossil fuel consumption. To that end, the Government, through the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, is currently reviewing the Public Spending Code to improve the calculation of the shadow price of carbon. This proposal will see future government capital investments valuing carbon at a level which will see the shadow price increase to €32 per tonne by 2020, €100 per tonne by 2030 and €265 by 2050. The Climate Plan also includes a new commitment to ensure that all government memoranda and major investment decisions are subject to a carbon impact and mitigation evaluation. The objective is to incorporate this requirement into cabinet procedures, regulatory impact assessments and in project appraisal processes. Consistent application of these rules will allow decision makers to better understand and appreciate the climate consequences of their investment options. Chair, that concludes my opening statement. My colleagues and I are available to answer any questions members of the committee might have. Thank you.
Deputy Chambers.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you all for your various presentations. There's quite a lot to get through, Chair, so I don't know what the...
5 minutes.
Okay, well, that's
First round.
quite impossible to get through all of this in
Well,
5 minutes.
make it
We'll come back
possible.
in again.
We'll come back to you.
In terms of the climate issue, we all agree that it's the biggest challenge facing our country. We have significant and difficult decisions to make as a Parliament, but also as citizens. And I don't think we are in agreement as to how best to make those decisions and how quickly we can achieve the aspirational elements, I think, of the government's climate plan that was published yesterday. Whilst we welcome the plan that was published yesterday, it is short on detail. There are no full costings available. We don't know how much it will cost to implement the plan, or even if it's possible to implement it within the timeframe allocated. I think it's hugely disappointing that we will miss our 2020 targets by a mile, by a long mile. And I think it's even questionable whether we can reach and meet our 2030 targets. So I suppose my first question to, all three contributors is, what is your view in terms of the costing of yesterday's plan? Is it credible? Is it achievable in terms of the timelines that have been set down by government yesterday?
In the order in which the speaker spoke, if you have a contribution to make. So.
All right. You're right that it would be nice to actually have costings on how much would be needed. I think that the implementation needs to be spelled out, what needs to be done. When you look at and what the macroeconomic impacts of it will be. If you look at the investment by people in cars, electric cars, that's assumed there, it may not actually involve a net increase in expenditure over what might otherwise take place, in that the argument is that actually it will save money if it'll save people money if they buy electric cars over the next decade, because electric cars will be the cheap option. At the moment, they're not.
The increase in carbon tax, we don't know the figure.
Well, and in terms of the investment in retrofitting houses, there I think that you need to spell out how you're going to ramp up that, and it needs to be done. It's going to be a gradual process. It isn't spelled out. But an essential ingredient in the plan, it does recognise that the carbon price needs to be between 30 and 80 euros a tonne to make it worthwhile people undertaking that investment. The size of that investment could be very large, and how that is scheduled and what the public sector's role in that would be. We have suggested that whatever resources the state has should concentrate first on local authority housing as a method of ramping up the capacity in the building construction sector and having significant side benefits. And also, of course, it is the landlord's job, not the tenant's job, to upgrade dwellings. But the work has not been done on how much is available for that and how you would ramp it up. So you are identifying an issue that needs further work.
Kelly.
Well, concerning the costs, I agree with Professor Fitzgerald that I think many of the options needed to reach the targets are cost effective, even without an increase in carbon tax. But I think whether we can reach the targets by 2030 will very much depend on how we can incentivize people to make these switches and to make the transition. And in my opinion, that's where a carbon tax is very relevant. I don't know if it's achievable. I think it really depends on what policies are put in place to incentivize behaviour to switch away from carbon.
Thank you. Just in terms of the carbon tax, it's been a hot topic for debate at this committee for quite some time now, and most of us are in agreement that a carbon tax is necessary. However, we have concerns around pushing people into fuel poverty, and those that are the poorest households will be hit the most. And I think, Mr. Broughan, you touched upon that in your opening statement, that a carbon tax on its own is quite regressive and does hit the poorest the hardest. You've interestingly spoke about I think recycling that tax, so not necessarily just giving it back in a lump sum, so you pay a carbon tax, so we'll hand you back a cheque at the end of the year, but that maybe you could use the carbon tax to offset, for example, income tax or other taxes that people pay in the country, and that actually can reduce emissions but also stimulate economic growth as well, which sounds good. I suppose, Mr. Fitzgerald, if I could put that to you, you're obviously a strong advocate of carbon tax. You've highlighted that former Nobel Prize winners have advocated that it is the first and essential step to reducing emissions. What is your Council's view of tax recycling? So rather than, I suppose, taking it with one hand and handing it straight back, what is your view on how best to implement a carbon tax?
Our view is that a substantial part of the revenue should be used to ensure that people on low incomes are not worse off and very possibly better off. And if you look at the ESRI paper published last week by Barrett and a colleague, it looks at a range of options, one where all the money was used to increase welfare benefits, which would lead to a significant reduction in poverty. If you used, and you can do the sums, it's up to the committee and the government to do the sums themselves, you could use maybe half the revenue in that way and half in some other way, which would ensure that people on low incomes don't lose out. So there are options there, but as a council, we feel that what is essential is that people on low incomes don't lose out, but there are a range of options which are available, and that's an issue for the Oireachtas and the government to decide.
My final question then, because I'm conscious that time is running out, is to the department. You've been quiet on the first two questions. Mr. Broughan, thank you for your evidence before the committee. I have to say, I did smile when I read the first page of your opening statement that there will be quarterly reporting on delivery. I'm sure that all of us will be looking forward to that quarterly reporting on delivery, because that is the criticism of yesterday's publication. We don't have any costings. We don't have a clear process for implementing the plan. So we have no idea how you propose to implement the plan that was published yesterday. It is very much aspirational, I think, parts of it. It sounds lovely in parts, but very, very expensive. So I would like to hear your response to what Mr Fitzgerald has said, that it would be nice to have costings, how you plan to implement the plan, and what is your view on how the carbon tax should be implemented, because I note you say, I don't want to dwell on potential additional revenue that can be raised through the carbon tax. Well, this is the Budgetary Oversight Committee, and that's exactly what we look at, is revenue-raising measures, where it should be spent, and how it can be best used to serve our citizens. So we very much do dwell on where that money will be used. So we'll be interested to hear your views on how the carbon tax should be implemented, where the revenue should go. Should it be handed back in a lump sum? Should it be tax recycled? Should it be used to pay down the national debt? Has been one suggestion, although I'm not sure that actually would benefit in the broader sense. And just one final question on that as well is, am I correct in saying that there's a target of having 1 million electric vehicles in the country by 2030? Is that even possible, given that we have less than 5,000 currently?
Deputy, thank you very much. I haven't had an opportunity to come in on your first two questions, so I will address those as well. I suppose, just to clarify the point I was trying to make in relation to dwelling on the additional revenue, I think I was picking up on a question in the committee's invitation, which was on the amount of additional revenue that could be raised from increasing the carbon tax, and that is a matter of public record from Tax Strategy Group papers, and that's the figure I provided there in my opening statement, which was €100 million for each additional €5 million raised. In terms of the potential use of additional revenue from the carbon tax, as I mentioned, the Department of Finance does have a consultation paper out on this particular issue at the moment, and the Department has explicitly picked up on the recommendations of Joint Committee on Climate Action on the potential options for recycling that revenue, either in terms of a dividend to individuals and households, or in terms of using the additional revenue into specific schemes which can be directed at people who are at risk of poverty, energy poverty, etc. So there are a number of options there which that department is considering and has invited submissions on. I expect that these will be considered as part of the budgetary process in due course, and decisions will be taken on what's the best approach to address that question of revenue recycling. On the question about the costs of implementing the plan, I suppose What the plan does is present I suppose, the most cost-effective way of reaching our targets for 2030 across all of the sectors in which greenhouse gas emissions arise.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but how do we know it's cost-effective if we don't know the cost of it?
I suppose what I'm trying to get around to is that the model that the plan takes is based on looking across all of the economy and the types of technologies that can be implemented, and that is based on a marginal abatement cost curve, which is set out in Chapter 4 of the plan. It is then a matter, I suppose, for policy design to determine the best way to actually achieve those targets for each of the various technologies, be it EVs, be it retrofitting, etc. So from that point of view, the plan doesn't set out specific costings because there is a policy design phase to come. And part of the, I suppose, the approach of the plan and the actions which have been set out in the plan is to sort of allow the space for that policy design phase to happen. So we're not preempting budgetary decisions in the plan in terms of how government will choose to implement and to reach those targets. There are design issues to be followed up on. There are questions in terms of whether it'll be through expenditure, whether it'll be through regulation, whether it'll be through taxation. So from that point of view, the plan doesn't set out the costings across the board. What I did indicate in my opening statement is that the exchequer resources that are available to the government are set out in the NDP, and that is the extent of the envelope of resources that are available.
Just to follow up on that particular question, because I've got a couple of points of clarification, Chair.
Yeah, and you are effectively out of time.
Thank you, Chair, for reminding me.
You can come back in later.
And I certainly will. It's a matter for government how they are going to pay to implement the plan. But we should, as a Budgetary Oversight Committee, know how much it costs to implement the plan. So, for example, how much will it cost to retrofit the current housing stock in the country? How much will it cost to implement a carbon tax, and how might that be implemented? These are reasonable questions. How much will it cost to the Exchequer if we are pushing people away from petrol and diesel, which we need to do? There's a loss of revenue to the Exchequer. These are very basic questions that, with respect, Mr Maughan, you and your team should be able to answer. You can't publish a plan like was published yesterday and have no information in terms of details on costing. That's just utterly ridiculous, and it makes our job impossible. It is government definitely have to decide. And one final point on that is the quarterly reporting on delivery. How can you report on delivering a plan if we don't know how you're going to deliver it, what your timeline for delivery is, and how much it's going to cost?
You are over at this
stage. We have nothing. It's a fair question, Chair, that I've asked and hasn't been answered.
I'm not saying it's not a fair question, Deputy. I'm saying you're over time.
Yes, and I know. Yeah,
and you can come back in.
Chair, my question should be: I've asked the question 3 times before you came into the chair. I've asked the question 3 times. How can we assess delivery if we have no costings, timeline for delivery? So we have nothing to say that we can't say you didn't meet this because we don't know what you're trying to meet.
Thank you.
Chair, if I may respond on the Deputy's question. In terms of delivery, the annex to the plan does set out quarterly deadlines for various steps under each of the 183 actions. And so when we speak about in the plan quarterly delivery and quarterly reporting, is reporting on whether those steps under each of those actions have been delivered or whether there were delays in the steps. So that is the way in which the plan will be transparent on its delivery. The various actions, as I mentioned, are addressing various commitments under the plan for each of the sectors, and each of those actions have detailed roadmaps with very, very specific steps with quarterly timelines. And the purpose of the quarterly reporting is to be able to report on and to publish whether government departments and agencies are actually meeting the commitments that the plan has set out for them in terms of those steps.
Thank you very much. Deputy Boyd Barrett.
Yeah, thanks for your contributions to all the different groups. I just don't understand the obsession with the carbon tax being imposed on households. If I understand the testimony given by the ESRI correctly, even though they favour it, they acknowledge that it's regressive. I'm quoting from your strong trend towards regression, I think is one phrase. You point out, I'll just finish the question first, that low-income households spend a much higher proportion of their income on transport and energy than, for example, high-income households. You also point out more affluent households have higher emissions, right? So those who have lower emissions, that's page 6 of your document. Just reading from it. So the centrepiece of the government strategy is to have a regressive tax which is going to hurt the people who have lower emissions and who are most vulnerable to the regressive character of that particular way of approaching it. And I would argue, but I'd be interested to hear your response, it flies in the face of at least some analysis of the application of carbon taxes elsewhere. Most notably, I cite this, the British Columbia carbon tax, produced by Food and Water Watch, where they argue that after the implementation of the carbon tax in British Columbia, the taxed emissions increased. Actually increased. The untaxed emissions decreased. So the implementation of carbon taxes on a particular type of emissions didn't actually impact. And insofar as there was an overall slight reduction in emissions, it was more to do with the fact that there was a recession in 2008 and 2009, right? So I just want to see, A, where's the evidence? In fact, there's counter-evidence that imposing what you seem to acknowledge as a regressive tax on people is going to actually do anything. And then I ask myself, well, where are we looking at the alternatives? You know, because all of this has been about carbon taxes imposed on households. Where's the costing and the economics and the sort of analysis of what would the impact be if we had public transport subsidies in this country up to the level of the highest in Europe? What would the impact in terms of behaviour be if we had free public transport? What would the impact of people using cars as against public transport if we had 1,000 extra buses in the public transport fleet? I'd like to see that, right? Because I bet you the impact would be much bigger than a very quick... What? Indeed, if they were electric. If they're electric, not, well, hybrid, there's quite serious questions over hybrid as well. So where's the sort of analysis of all these things? Or what's, you know, the analysis of, let's say we increased current afforestation levels from 6,000, which is well below our own stated targets, hectares per year, to 10,000 hectares per year, and it was based on broadleaf, more sustainable forestry models. What would the economic impact be? What would the cost be? What would the benefit be in terms of carbon sinks and so on? Where's the analysis of all that? It just seems heavily loaded in the direction of a particular approach to this, which is potentially regressive.
On the evidence on the fact that carbon taxes work, I said that it is exceptionally difficult to find any professional economist publishing in an academic journal who suggests other than that carbon taxes work. That there just aren't carbon tax deniers who actually have done economic work. So the evidence, as in climate change is a huge problem, and carbon taxes work. So the example which you gave, it is true that we have a carbon tax of 20 euros a tonne, and emissions have still risen. Emissions have risen because the economy has grown. Emissions would have been higher, the evidence shows, if we hadn't had a carbon tax of 20 euros a tonne. So the example you give in British Columbia takes no account of the other factors that are driving emissions. You did acknowledge that a recession or the state of the economic cycle in British Columbia can have an effect. So for me, if you look at the literature, and my job in a previous job as an academic economist was to look at the literature, and I see Kelly nodding in this regard. So there is pretty well unanimity that they work. On the issue of regression,
By the way, but anyway.
On the issue of the regressive nature, if you look at Going back to 1992, the research shows, yes, they are regressive. But going back to 1992, the research shows that if you use some, but not all of the revenue to compensate those in low incomes, they will be no worse off. And the paper by Barrett last week shows they would actually be better off if you used all of the revenue. So that's the evidence. It is up to the Oireachtas to decide how they want to distribute the income, but the net effect of introducing a substantial increase in carbon taxes and using it in various ways could be that you would leave people on low incomes better off rather than worse off, and the climate much better off.
Did you want to respond? I'll come on a brief supplementary.
No, I'm in agreement with Professor Fitzgerald. As economists, the reason why we are so focused on a carbon tax is because it directly taxes the thing we want to get rid of. And that is the most effective way to deal with this problem, in our opinion. And yes, a carbon tax is, without using the revenue in an appropriate manner, is regressive. But that's exactly why we have policymakers that can make a policy to counteract this regressiveness. And we agree, as John pointed out, that if you use, for example, half of the revenue to reduce other taxes and half to compensate poorer households, you can get both an economic boost from the carbon tax as well as fight the regressiveness of the tax. So an appropriate carbon tax policy is not regressive. And I think...
If I might just come in on that, in terms, we are not advocating a carbon tax on its own in isolation from recycling. I think the ESRI is very clear in that how you recycle is important for the benefit of the tax. We have 3 different teams at the ESRI looking at different aspects of the carbon tax. And one part of that, one of those teams, which we published, I think it was last week in a related to quarterly economic commentary, was looking at whether you hand back the revenue in this green check or target the revenue to those most in need. And our conclusion from that is that the green check, where you give every household back the same amount, yes, you can, in a sense, compensate the extra tax, but you would do much better if you focus that recycling of revenue to the fuel poor, if you focus that revenue to the ones most in need. And that was very clearly demonstrated. You also asked a question about, or suggested that we've focus entirely on the carbon tax. I would suggest, we haven't done that in terms of what are the alternatives. We've spent, myself, a couple of years looking at household retrofits and using the data in collaboration with SEAI on people taking out the retrofit grants and how they responded to them. And some of the conclusions from that research has been taken on board in the plan. I saw yesterday when they've announced a one-stop shop to help people go about retrofits, because what we found, even though the grant was there encouraging people to get involved, we found that people applied for the grant but didn't follow up because they found it difficult to, in terms of the barriers, whether it was just organising tradespeople or that kind of stuff. So the research that we've done in the past has influenced various aspects of the plan and not just on the carbon tax.
Deputy.
Yeah, okay. First of all, I don't think it's beyond question. And to be honest, all you've done is assert that everybody, whoever they are, has proved the effectiveness. And I just cited one example where the evidence shows that the taxed emissions increased and the untaxed emissions went down in British Columbia. Okay, so the opposite of the case of the tax has been more effective, if you like, right? So I think that sort of evidence needs to be scrutinised before we can make assertions, just blank assertions that they're necessarily effective. You've also rightly pointed out yourself, we already have a carbon tax and our emissions continue to climb. And are we recycling the money that's being generated at the moment to impact on our emissions? Well, signs on it, we're not. We're not doing that, even though there's a considerable amount of money being generated from it. And unless it's recycled, and you seem to be acknowledging this, unless it's recycled in a fair and effective way, it is regressive. But the experience already is we're not recycling it in a way that's being either effective or counteracting its regressive impacts.
Boy Barrett, sorry. No, yes.
In terms, we may assert here today, but the assertion is based on a considerable body of research. The ESRI's work, the reports that we put out, the analysis transparent, we submitted for peer review, so not just our colleagues within the Institute, but anonymous peer reviews from universities and the like. In terms of emissions have been growing. We had a reduction in emissions during the crisis. The economy contracted. But as Professor Fitzgerald has indicated, the country is expanding both in terms of the size of the economy and the population. So just by the nature of that, we would expect a growth in emissions. What John was pointing out was that if petrol was cheaper, if fuel was cheaper, we would have more emissions. We have put out there the evidence, and it's for this committee and others to take it on board.
Thank you very much. Does anybody else want to? Okay, thank you. Deputy Lahart.
Thanks, Chair. I'll be quick. Just a few questions. So, carbon tax denial, that's a new phrase on me, and carbon tax deniers, and I think it's something that will come out of the committee today. And you feel that strongly about it in terms of the academic research and backup in relation to it. Just for the department, if I can, the Budgetary Oversight Committee received we receive documents regularly, but one of the recent ones was an overview and analysis of major infrastructure projects under the NDP. And, you know, they're costed. Some of the costs are significantly overrunning already, even beyond 2027, planned beyond 2027. But they're costed, and there is a capital tracker for it. So you guys would have met. You're the team that advised the Minister on this, I'm sure, along with others, and the work that was done by the Climate Action Committee and the Citizens' Assembly obviously all fed into that. At some stage, you must have had engagement. And I ask this from a budgetary oversight point of view. You must have had engagement with the Department of Expenditure and Public Expenditure and Reform in terms of how much all of these proposals were going to cost and how much they would cost over a period of time. So have you any costings?
Deputy, I think, again, to come back to, I suppose, my earlier intervention, the overall envelope for the resources available for climate action is set out in the National Development Plan. There are specific projects, as you've identified, that are listed in the project tracker that is published by the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, some of which relate to projects which feature in here. So I suppose from that point of view, the two kind of policies and plans do very much dovetail. As I mentioned already, this plan doesn't actually include specific costings because the approach taken is to actually set out at this point in time overall what the most cost-effective way of reaching our targets will be. Across the various sectors, there are various sets of targets which can be delivered by public expenditure.
Costing, for example, on I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we'll say a car scrappage scheme, diesel car scrappage scheme to incentivise people to purchase electric cars. Have you put any costing on that?
That's a specific proposal. I think this was mentioned yesterday, I think, in questions to ministers at the launch of the plan. The proposal in the plan is to examine the potential of a car scrappage scheme. No, but I'm just asking at this point in time.
I know I've only 5 minutes, and I do thank you for your service, and I'm not trying to make it personal. There's no costing for that.
The proposal in the plan, Deputy, is to examine the potential of a car.
So there's no costing.
So right now,
there's no costing.
That's not because that analysis hasn't yet commenced, but that is to be delivered, as I understand,
but it's policy.
From memory, in 2020. So in due course, and again, through the quarterly reporting, we will have the outcome of that review, and as part of that review, the potential will be examined.
And again, I'm just asking it as a member of the Budgetary Oversight Committee. In relation to the cost of missing targets, so a briefing that we would have as Budgetary Oversight members says that the Department of Finance have indicated that Ireland is at risk of being subject to fines of 600 million annually from 2021 if targets aren't to be met, and it suggests that Ireland could be subject to 6 billion in fines between 2021 and 30. Now, in your contribution you're saying Ireland is required under EU rules to reduce emissions, etc. Current EPA projections indicate that relevant emissions could remain at between 0% and 1% below 2005 levels, which are the levels required by 2020, which means there'll be no fines.
So I think, Deputy, you're talking on the one hand about the estimates of the potential cost of compliance with reaching our 2030 targets, and then you've talked also about the 2020 targets as part of your question.
Yeah.
So the figures I mentioned were, the costings figures that I mentioned were in relation to the cost of compliance with 2020 targets. The estimates in relation to 2030...
Let's not move on to 2030 just for a sec. So, if we continue the way we are and did nothing, we face no fines by December 31st, 2020.
We don't face any fines as such. So we have purchased a volume of credits to allow us to be compliant with those targets for 2020. And as I indicated in my opening statement, we do have a requirement to purchase a number of additional credits so that we can be compliant with those targets. So,
in monetary terms, would those additional credits be?
As I mentioned in my opening statement, it's 6 and 13 million euros in terms of additional costs.
People get these figures then, you know, that we face millions, hundreds of millions in fines for missing 2020 targets.
So there are various estimates that have been put out by various parties, and sometimes those estimates do also include the costs of potential compliance with our renewable energy targets. It's mixed in with our emissions targets, which is a separate framework, and there's a separate compliance regime attached to that at EU level. And there will be a requirement, as I understand it, to purchase compliance with that framework as well, in case there is a shortfall in reaching the renewable energy targets.
Just as a layman then, if I was to say, look, how much, because I don't know the headings under which all, or the frameworks under which all these fines may issue, but you do. So we'll say, taking all the potential liabilities, if we stood still and did nothing between now and 31st of December 2020, what are the potential fines to the country from the EU Commission or anybody else under every heading?
Maybe I can just speak briefly about. So Frank has talked about the emission reduction fine in this 6 to 13. The answer is, in terms of the renewable energy target, so this is where we have a 16% target and we're projected to reach about 13%, so 3 percentage points short. The very large figures you would have quoted come from an initial estimate a number of years ago that had a range of between, I think it was 65 and 130 million per percentage point, so you need to multiply those by 3. We don't know what the cost of purchasing the statistical transfers from other countries might be, but based on, and there have been limited trade so far, those costs have been about 20 to 25 million per percentage point. So that would give an estimate, and it is a very ballpark estimate, of 60 to 75 million for compliance with renewable energy targets. That would be on top of what Frank has described. But I do want to stress that we're basing those estimates based on a trade that was done between two particular countries, and we don't have certainty on that yet.
Thanks, Chair. So what is the climate action, climate advisory, what's your view on this and the SRI's view on this? How much are we potentially facing by the 31st of December 2020 if we do nothing?
I found the question which you asked and the answer which you have now got very useful. I'm sure the Department are right. You're talking in terms of relatively small sums in 2021 or 2020. It is we're now looking at 2030, although probably it's of less focus to this committee. So I think the Department, their answer sounds to me sensible. Well, it sounds. I have no reason. Yeah,
to 2020. You've thrown in the towel.
Yeah,
take your beat.
It sounds as if the cost to Ireland of non-compliance will be relatively low, all things considered. That is my assessment, having listened to the Department.
I suppose the ESRI has been working on, I suppose, the policy measures to achieve compliance, and we haven't, in a sense, been tracking all the framework in which the different allowances and the markets for these allowances. So we defer to the better knowledge of the department in this case.
Why all the urgency then for not that shy of our target?
Because 2030 is coming up.
No, I was just saying in terms of 2020, you're going to be 1% below the 2005 levels by 2020.
Because by failing to meet our 2020 target through policies over the last decade, or inadequate policies, we have an even bigger ask. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, when you go to 2030, and even if we meet our 2030 target, the ask after 2030 becomes even more difficult. So the concern is we're pushing the issue further down the line. I'll be dead before the crisis hits, but I think you may face more of a problem.
Yeah, you're very
The only reason the 2020 targets are we almost hitting them is because of the recession. If it wasn't for the recession, we would be in a lot bigger trouble with the 2020 targets.
And just one further thing on compliance, and maybe the department will correct me, but those higher figures in terms of what you talked about in the past, the compliance cost, were based on a higher, say, ETS price and carbon price in the market. That hasn't come to pass, so in a sense, the cost of compliance for 2020 we've got off light because the market for complying with these things hasn't been as steep as anticipated. But we anticipate it will in future.
Can I backtrack just on the issue of costings? The vast bulk of the expenditure in heating and transport on meeting the targets which are set out for the sectors will be undertaken by the private sector, so that the vast bulk of the expenditure on transport will be by people deciding to buy an electric car because it is the cheap option, providing the carbon price is right. So they would have spent money on a car anyway. And in terms of heating, if the carbon price is right, people will spend money on insulating their homes, and over the period to 2050 they will be better off as a result. So expenditure and investment will be higher, but their outgoings on energy in the subsequent 20-year period will be much lower. However, the issue for me is the bulk of expenditure on a spreadsheet will be taken by households and deciding on their car and their house in a way that will save money. But that's on a spreadsheet. Behaviour is different. And having done it myself, it saved me a load of money, but it was the hassle of doing it. And that's where the state needs to target resources in terms of you've got to give people a push. You've got to make it easy. And one of the issues, I think, in the plan, which I think is a reflection of these problems, was how you do it at scale. If I had to go out and find a builder and find an engineer on how I'm going to do my house, the hassle of doing it and the certainty, whereas if the state manages to push the building industry into developing the expertise and ramping up, so they come into my estate and offer everybody in the estate, we'll do your house for a knockdown price and the local authority guarantees that it'll be done efficiently, then you'd get much more take-up. So the state needs to measures which will give this push, and that's where I think there is a gap where further work needs to be done, given that the bulk of expenditure in these areas will be undertaken by the private sector, but it will need state intervention to give it a push.
You okay? Okay, thank you very much, Deputy Lahart. Deputy Breathnach.
Yeah, thanks for the presentations. I'm sceptical, to say the least. Generations of teachers like myself and people have talked about climate change, certainly, for up on 50, 60 years. And we talked about the situation of Armageddon arriving if we didn't deal with it. And yet we still have the politicians and ourselves and the professionals grappling with it, despite the fact that the curriculum, and mention was made of it the other day, about the need to reinforce a curriculum. People know that this has been coming down the line, most people, and I'll try and be specific in my questions, that other people have obviously asked some that I wanted to, but the issue of the implications for revenue in relation to the reduction in oil and diesel as a result of this change, have you done any calculations on that? Is there a need to climate-proof a budget, the same way as gender budgeting, so that we can have a clear statement of intent? And I suppose there are people, nobody, and I said this the last day we were talking with the Fiscal Council people, there's nobody likes to pay additional taxes, and the reality is that there are some who can afford it, but there are always those who can't, and we have figures that 28% of the population on an annual basis are experiencing fuel poverty, and therefore my concern specifically will be, and mention was made of 30% or 50% of the carbon tax being returned to them. I'd like you to comment on, and mention was made by Dr. Curtis in relation to people not taking up various schemes. People like the Vincent de Paul would suggest that immediately there should be community energy advisors brought in to, lower socio-economic income in order to make those necessary savings. And indeed, some local authorities have been very proactive in that, indeed, prior to now. But would you comment on that and how you make that transition on low carbon economy that is fair and obviously socially just? And two final points, and I won't be coming back in, Chairman, is that, you talk about retrofitting and we hear about skills and the expertise needed. Have you done an assessment as to whether that type of manpower is available? I certainly doubt that it is, particularly if our economy continues to grow at the rate it is growing. And, again, mention was made by the RSI, by Kelly, in relation to the issue of the impact of rural, greater impact on rural than urban. And have you looked at the whole issue of the need to increase the whole rural transport system? And last but not least, the sceptic, I start representing the sceptic in me, over the last series of debate on this, I'd asked the question, where are people going to go with these electric cars after their lifetime? Very simple question. The reality is that the car will be clapped out as well. You will have no competition. If you buy a car from a particular dealer, they'll tell you to put it in the scrap heap. And the people I speak with, who either own a diesel car or a petrol car who are struggling, will find it very, very difficult to make ends meet. Anyone who has bought a family car, £18,000, £20,000 over the last couple of years, there's no scrappage scheme going to compensate them in relation to that loss of revenue. And I honestly believe that we need to cost this properly. And I smiled when Kelly read, I've almost finished, when she read about, I think she talked about a technical study. I can't find it now, but the language in it, and I've said this at other committee meetings of this year, if we want to get people who don't understand the need to make these adjustments and to understand them, we need to get into a less difficult language. And that brings me back to those who can afford to make it and those who can't. We need to be speaking to ordinary people out there, and I mentioned the issue of energy advisors and people who can go out and get people to see that they can make savings. And I don't believe that in the explanations that have been done to date that message has been get across to those who need to take corrective action. I'd ask you to comment on that.
I think there are 6 questions there. Oil and diesel, what will happen once all the transport is electrified? The state will lose £5 billion in revenue. And the Department of Finance have published a paper beginning to look at this. So it is an issue. It's going to be a while before the revenue begins to fall off. It's only when you get the acceptance of electric cars, but that is going to be an issue. In terms of climate proofing the budget, yes, sounds like a good idea to check what the effect will be. On local authorities and people on low incomes, first of all, I think the state owns over 100,000 dwellings out of the 2 million local authority dwellings, and the state has the duty to upgrade them, not the tenant. And Kilkenny County Council did an interesting job on a local authority estate a number of years ago in Kilkenny. And some of the local authority dwellings were privately owned, but they contracted with somebody to go in and put external cladding on and do a job on the dwellings. And those in the privately owned dwellings said, could we pay and opt into the scheme? And it's actually this scheme which I think is one of the pilots on what would work. Now, there were some problems with the scheme, but that is the way, because advisors, it's not just people on low incomes. I was talking to 3 people on very high incomes who don't know where to go to for advice. So I think that is an issue, and that's why the department's talking about ramping up and training. You asked about the staffing available. It's not available. You have a building construction sector which is constrained. So that's why I think the department, they know this, and that aspect of the plan, it needs to be spelled out, but I think it is important they are being realistic that you need to actually do work to develop the supply side. Rural versus urban, there's a very important paper by Edgar Morganroth and Richard Tall over a decade ago. The reason why it falls more on rural Ireland than in urban Ireland is because of commuters. And Barrett Rowntree actually has an interesting piece in his paper last week on this, that if you take out commuters, actually farmers pottering around in their local area actually aren't using enough, they're not driving huge mileage or kilometrage. It is the commuters. And the reason why you need a carbon tax is to persuade the commuters, the early adopters of electric cars. Because, yes, if they continue to drive a fossil fuel car in 2027, they will be paying a lot of money. But they will have the option then to drive an electric car to commute in and out to work to Galway or Dublin and actually pay much less. So this issue about the rural versus urban, it's related to the commuting, to the driving. It's not related to the energy use in the household. And actually, that's why you need to ramp up the price to persuade commuters. Also, the national planning framework, which calls for denser development. In the future, we don't want more commuters. Now, people who are commuting, you're not going to change pattern, but we want denser development so you don't get commuting, and it's one of the issues which Deputy Boyd Barrett raised in terms of public transport, that it becomes effective when people live in an urban area, but people travelling into Galway from all over the county, really public transport isn't an option. And the final thing on the residual value of cars, it is certainly an issue. Remember that cars depreciate at 20% a year, so if you pay 20,000 today, it'll be 16,000 next year. After 3 years, it's 10,000. By 2030, when you've got to get out of fossil fuel cars, it'll be worth nothing. So if you're going to buy a car today, you need to think about the residual value of the car. Should you buy an electric car? And it is this uncertainty, which is going to drive early adoption of electric vehicles. And it is not because the state is going to go out and tell people to do it, it's because people see actually the risk of buying a fossil fuel car in 2021, it could be worth nothing in 2027, so maybe I should go electric. These are the things that will drive change.
Okay. So.
Yeah, I'd just like to comment on a few relevant topics. You were talking about the diesel and petrol excise duties and their impact on the revenue receipts. The numbers I showed include that impact. So you see that if you don't recycle the revenue, if you just use it to reduce government debt, the net impact will be negative. But if you recycle the revenue, that decrease in excise duties will be compensated by an increase in other sale tax receipts. So the net impact will be positive. And also just concerning the fuel poverty issue, Brussels and Rowntree do look specifically at fuel poverty, and they see that a €10 increase in the carbon tax would increase fuel poverty by about 1%, but the redistribution scheme can compensate for that.
Okay. Yes.
Sure, thank you. So I might just come back on a couple of issues that the Deputy has raised. First of all, in relation to climate proofing of the budget, I did mention already that the plan contains a new commitment in relation to carbon proofing government memoranda and individual investment appraisals, and that's That's going to be, I suppose, strengthened as part of the public spending code, which the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform is working through at the moment. Separately, in relation to the budget itself, the Minister for Finance in last year's budget statement did give an undertaking, in my recollection, in relation to developing green budgeting as part of the budgetary framework into the future. And I think in this year's revised estimates volume, there is an appendix which relates to the individual subheads across government departments that are related to climate action specific. My understanding is that the department intends to further develop that in due course. In relation to skills and retrofitting, that's something that we very much acknowledge as an issue which will have to be tackled and has been addressed with specific actions under the plan. This, I suppose, has a number of aspects. There's the whole issue about sort of the skills base required for retrofitting of buildings to what will be required in the future, which is a very, very deep level of retrofit, much more beyond what's currently being done. There's a recognition that there's, I suppose, a need to, I suppose, scale up the existing construction industry, and there are specific commitments to develop accredited courses through the education and training boards to allow that to be done. There's also, I suppose, a recognition in relation to sort of the issues around replacement of oil and gas boilers, and that will also require a skilling up of that side of things as well, and that's also addressed in the plan. You mentioned rural transport. There is a commitment in the plan in relation to the development of a rural transport strategy for the Department of Transport. So just to pick up on some specific points there.
Yeah, just a couple of points. You mentioned about community energy advisors in St Vincent de Paul, and we've actually spoken with St Vincent de Paul about some of the research, and I don't think it's just community energy advisors for I suppose low-income households, but right across the spectrum. I think there is a lack of independent advice out there, and some work that we're actually doing with colleagues right now in UCC is that even with the same expenditure and investment, like the retrofit options that households have done, that if there were better options there in the sense of people go in and think that they need to replace their windows, get double glaze or whatever, that if they had independent advice of what was best for their house, for the same money, they might have had a better option. But from work we've done ourselves, the advice that households most closely rely on tend to be their neighbour or their builder or plumber, which in essence it is not, with new technology and new materials, they may not always be best informed. In terms of SEI at present offer or have a number of schemes for grants there's a warmer home. Well, you get confused with the names, but the different levels of income and that. But the scheme that has had the biggest, I suppose, uptake is the Better Energy Homes, which essentially it's a 30 to 35% grant on top of the cost, but that scheme essentially needs to find people who can co-finance the remaining 60 to 65 or 70%, and in that sense, as a grant scheme, it is quite good and has done quite a lot, but there are a lot of people that are excluded that cannot afford that extra grant, and yeah, so maybe I just leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Deputy Cowen.
Thank you, Chair. Now, as we know, this is a budget oversight committee, and I don't want to overstep our remit, because we all accept our responsibility to ensure that budgets provide for and acknowledge the cost implications of meaningful policies ensuring the economy and the people arrest and decrease carbonisation. And the Fianna Fáil Green Government began that process by implementing carbon tax in the first place. The failure of government in recent years has been the fact that they haven't ring-fenced the proceeds from that for specifically incentivising alternatives in energy provision or retrofits and so forth. Now, to deal with the three witnesses that are before us, in the first instance, the Climate Advisory Council was to give its opinion on how best climate change can be addressed in the forthcoming budget. Is that correct? It supports, it says, investing or increasing carbon tax from 20 per tonne to 35. Is that right? This year?
For next year.
Yeah, in the forthcoming budget. You also say that we should see more investment by government in climate change actions and that it should lead from the front, so to speak. Do you think it's leading from the front when it buys 3 hybrid buses and 200 diesel ones?
No, I specifically in the statement said that if you actually take account in the public expenditure code, if you value the price of carbon emitted next year at €80 a tonne, rising to 260 by, the buses will be around for 20 years. Actually, the amount of damage which they would do to the climate over that period. In other words, if you apply the public expenditure code, you wouldn't be out buying those kind of buses.
Okay. Do you agree? And I think the SRI came down on the side of incremental increases over a period of time. If it's 80% over the next 10 years, for example, it should be 8% per annum. That gives certainty to the budget process, that gives certainty to the public in relation to the cost implications of them continuing assisting pollution, you could say.
What I think is essential is to lay out a trajectory for the next decade.
So it's not,
if it was 30 in the budget and then 5 a year thereafter, it is.
Okay. So again, it's not really leading from the front when it says that they look at it year on year and give the public no indication of what the implications are going to be over the next 10 to 12 years. I think that's the point of the SRI we're making. You also made a pertinent point that it's regressive in nature in its present format, and that there has to be provision for that to be addressed in putting forward a policy or giving a pathway for its increasing it over the next number of years. Yeah? You'd agree with that? Okay. In relation to the department, and I'm with my colleague, Deputy Chambers, on this, it's a lot of motherhood and apple pie, to be quite honest. And, you know, I come from a county of Offaly, which is Bordemona country, ESB country, where the government of the day in the 30s and 40s was told to provide a mechanism by which jobs could be created in that region. And it was quite successful, thank God. And it created up to 8,000 jobs at its peak in the 80s. But at present, it is accelerating its decarbonisation programme. It is seeing its workforce come down to less than 1,000. And the public buy into it, strangely enough, and thankfully, for everybody's sake. And the workforce buy into it. And the local authority has led and put a transition forum in place with all relevant stakeholders to assist and help and ensure that the workforce is adequately trained and upskilled to provide alternatives. But we haven't seen the same input and the same effort or the same cohesive, specific targeting of that region by government. They didn't, for example, even apply to the last Commission to include the peatlands regions in the EU coal mine transition fund. And that failure was recognised by myself and another councillor from the county when we went out there last year. And we have to wait on a new commission to be put in place for the government to bring forward its application and ensure there's something done in the future. And that's the background, and that's the unfortunate. The public are very interested and committed to buying into this, but they have to see the same commitment and buy-in from government. They have to see that if they are making a commitment, well, what are they getting in return? And the specifics that's contained in here are so woolly that they can't recognise or see what's in a plan. You know, and again, to go back to the remit of this committee and to my responsibility, and I hope you exclude the answers that have been given to date in relation to calculation of those 5 minutes. There's been no costings.
To be absolutely clear, as I have with everybody, that is excluded. Your time contribution is measured entirely on when you speak.
Thank you. Thanks. That's all the only clarification I wanted. It's very disappointing that there's no costings. We've only, you know, come out of a phase whereby we hear and we see that the Children's Hospital and the National Development Plan, within the National Development Plan, the Broadband Plan, combined add an extra €2.5 billion to the National Development Plan. And we're told by the Minister that that will come from future revenues, when we have the Financial Advisory Council telling us, the Fiscal Advisory Council telling us that that's not credible. How credible is it now for this plan to be brought forward and no proof given to us or provided to us that the National Development Plan itself has been climate-proofed, and no costings contained within this plan that is published yesterday, which seems to be merely a political reaction to the recent political competition we had, rather than a meaningful effort to inform the public that it will buy into this project with them and it will help and assist them and nudge them along. How will they be nudged along or given an incentive to ensure that that nudge is meaningful?
Thank you. Whoever wants to start first.
I think in response to the Deputy, I think I've addressed the question already in relation to the costings. I just want to come back in relation to the point he makes in relation to the Midlands specifically, and the suggestion that the application for the coal regions in transition we've missed the boat somehow on that application. I understand that discussion is still ongoing with the Commission.
Said you were very late.
That it's not completely closed off. I understand that discussion is still ongoing with the Commission. So just to clarify that particular point.
Anybody else? You haven't got the answers. Okay. Thank you very much. Next, I have Deputy Doherty.
Sure, Michael. Thanks for your presentations and coming to the committee. Look, I don't want to labour on the fact that we've no costings here, and the irony here, we are a budgetary oversight, but we can't do much oversight when we don't have any numbers attached to the document. But look, I welcome the fact that we have a plan, and there may be differences where we differ in relation to parts of the plan. But can I maybe start with the department, because we've seen, obviously, in the department are very much behind this plan, but we've seen from your website, if you look at your website today, you'll see applications for survey for the fossil fuel companies in the southwest that have been received in the last couple of weeks. You'll see that there's been 10 applications since December. So are we going to see the rhetoric in this plan matched up by action? Is the department going to change its course and stop issuing licences for fossil fuel exploration, while we've just spent the last hour talking about how we need to electrify and decarbonise our environment and our transport fleet and so on? So maybe could the department give us an insight as to whether the legislation that's before this House in relation to ending the drilling for fossil fuels, have they had a change of view in relation to that, or are you going to continue to oppose that legislation?
Chair, I suppose very briefly, there is a government position on this bill. The plan published yesterday doesn't change that government position, and the Minister has been very clear in terms of his perspective on that bill. So there's nothing new to say on that, unfortunately.
Can I ask some of our other guests, because we talk about signals, price signalling and all the rest. So what signal does it send to an industry when we say we're open for applications to drill for oil off our coast? These are the same oil companies. In fairness, and Mr Fitzgerald pointed out accurately the level of economists who supported the carbon tax, but they are also supported by BP, by Shell, by Exxon, by all of the major oil companies, indeed in the United States. They support that measure because it focuses on that point. What does this signalling do when we still say we're open for business for drilling for fossil fuels, while at the same time we put on paper the need to ask individuals, and really this plan asks individuals to dig into their own pockets, to invest in different motor vehicles, to invest in upgrading their own house, to do their bit for environment, when the department overseeing it is still saying we're open for business for drilling for fossil fuels, in your view?
The Council has not published on this as yet. I think pumping more oil is not part of the solution to climate change. The one area where there would be a concern is that in the next 20 years, gas will be a significant part of the solution. For example, compressed natural gas in terms of heavy goods vehicles. If you could switch in urban areas for the next 15-20 years, people from oil to gas, that would be beneficial. And because electricity, the backup supply, we will hopefully close peat and coal, it would be very dependent on gas. So a secure supply of gas is important if you could separate it from oil. But pumping oil really doesn't sound like, it is not a solution to climate change, it's the opposite.
I might say, whatever the merits of future exploration. The ESRI has done a lot of work on the energy sector, in particular the power, electricity sector, looking at the economics of it, and with engineer colleagues in Cork and UCC and UCD. And the analysis looking at there at integrating more renewables, more wind onto the system and modelling out to 2050, we are still to keep the lights on through that period, and even moving to net zero carbon, we are going to need fossil fuels, in particular gas, to keep the lights on. So, we may have aspirations for electric vehicles and all the rest, but we still need to keep the economy going. We would still be relying for quite a while on fossil fuels.
How long do you think we should continue to? How long should the Minister continue to offer these major oil companies licences to drill for oil offshore? Because that argument can be made in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time.
Well, that's true, and well, it's not my area of expertise, but the idea I was trying to put out there was that we are going to be reliant on them, and that's what I prefaced it by saying, what about the merits of future exploration? We will need that for the near future.
There's a technical issue which I don't know the answer to. Could you say you can drill for gas but not for oil? Gas, providing gas would have certain benefits. I cannot see that more oil will benefit climate change. In terms of gas, I should clarify that by 2050 there should be net zero emissions, so that the carbon dioxide produced by burning the gas should be pumped back into the ground, probably into the empty Kinsale oil field, our gas field. So gas, but I don't know what the answer is. I'm not sure that you can say you can drill for gas and not for oil. And if you can't, are you better saying drill for nothing? I'd want to take technical advice on that, and we haven't considered it.
Can I ask in relation to the retrofitting of homes? There's 500,000 targeted between now and 2030, which sounds impressive, but actually when you look at the detail, it's actually only 5,000 more per year than what was originally laid out in the National Development Plan. And none of them, or very few of them, will be deep retrofitting, because obviously B2 rating wouldn't allow for that. So is this project ambitious enough in your view? And will we need to, in your view, provide additional incentives to individuals? We hear stuff in the media, and people listen to this here probably wouldn't have a clue. So if you're living in Donegal and you're living in a house that was built in the early 80s, what would the cost be to bring it up to a B2 or an A1 standard? That's the questions they have, and they're scared. They're scared because they don't have that type of money. They don't see the supports there. The supports coming from Sustainable Energy Ireland are great if you can afford the other proportion for it, and if you're willing to wait for the savings over the medium and long term. But many people can't afford to do that. So, is there, in your view, additional supports required?
I think that we should look to the experience of the Housing Executive in Northern Ireland. When I was under the Northern Ireland Authority for Energy Regulation in the last decade for 4 years, they undertook 2 very interesting experiments, one in Knocknacloy and another where there had been a major massacre in the previous 20 years, and another in a village, which the Protestant village. And they discovered that actually if you go in and say you're going to offering the village, you get much more acceptance, whereas if you're a 70-year-old like myself up the side of a mountain in Donegal, I'm scared somebody'd burgle me, or I'll be done on it, or whatever. So trying to do it on a community basis, you're more likely to get buy-in, in particular in rural areas, and also, as I said, in Kilkenny, that people don't know what the right thing to do is. They may be willing to do it, and the Housing Executive, because they have a much larger local authority housing stock in Northern Ireland, have experience of ramping up. And I want to get them down to talk to us about how to do it. One of the things, just in talking to somebody at the margins of a meeting, he said that the lesson is you go in and do the same, you offer the same for all the houses, you don't differentiate. Now, I want to tease this out. So I think learning from what's happened in on many cases we think we know the best and we may do things more efficiently, but actually the housing executive is an interesting example which we need to look at.
Finally, I think we're running out of time, but like there's a debate, and you opened up, and the focus here was a bit about the carbon tax, and there's a debate that's taken place in America where the economists signed that letter about the new Green Deal or a focus on carbon taxes. As I said, which is supported by the economists, but also supported by the industry. And it's really a debate about whether we need to be investing and whether the state needs to play a bigger role, like rolling out deep retrofitting, like more supports for energy efficient cars, like electric vehicles, like your public fleet, like your public infrastructure, as opposed to just a market solution. The problem and the challenge I see at this point in time, because we need to meet these targets, is that many people can't simply do it. So the cost of retrofitting their homes, even with the supports, is way beyond their means. The cost of buying an electric vehicle is way beyond their means, and telling them that they will make so much savings in 5, 6, 7 or 8, 9, 10 years is not enough. And then we have areas where they can, and I'll finish on this here, where they can actually get some money to actually, to offset some of those costs is in microgeneration. And maybe if I can focus in the department on this question, we have a piece of legislation drafted by Brian Stanley. For 2 years, it has passed the Dáil. It has been obstructed at committee stage, the microgeneration bill, by the government, by the department, and yet we see this nice glossy report with no costings and a lot of ambition. But yes, we're going to do microgeneration. Like, how do we take for face value there when there is an obstruction at the other hand to block pieces of legislation which would do actually what some of this the measures in this bill outline? So maybe my question is there a change of heart in relation to the microgeneration piece of legislation also, or will you continue to block that piece of legislation?
Yeah. Let's start for
Deputy, just very briefly in response to the question on microgeneration, my recollection was that the Minister accepted the broad principles of that bill at second stage, but there obviously may have been some differences of views about the detail of the bill, but the Minister has now come forward through the plan with how he proposes to implement a microgeneration framework in Ireland, which takes account of the need to, I suppose, have a framework that will reimburse householders for the export of excess electricity to the grid. So there are a number of kind of design steps to work through in putting that in place, but the Minister is very ambitious to get that in place as soon as possible. But in terms of the differences the Minister might have with Deputy Stanley on his bill, I can't speak to the details of that. I'm sorry.
Thank you.
In relation to the question on that issue of the new Green Deal, that debate versus market solutions, and the need for the state also to step up in investment, because you could. We have the point. The point is, obviously, if you want behavioural changes, taxes can work as long as the alternatives there and within reach.
In our reports, we've made the point that getting the price right is only the beginning. That in order to help people change, you need to have a major range of other policies. The state has a major role in this regard. Who is going to? And that's why we're interested in possibly focusing first on local authority dwellings, where the state has the role. And how can you drive the development of capacity? If you do it, there are multiple benefits that may. In terms of the infrastructure, somebody came to see me this morning from Louth, and he drove down from Dundalk to Dublin, and the charger at the 2 service stations on the way down were broken. Now, he just got to Dublin and found somewhere to charge his car. It is the responsibility of the state and the regulatory authorities to ensure the rollout of the infrastructure, and the infrastructure must be rolled out in advance. Like, I'm not going to buy an electric car unless I know I can get to Kilcrahan and charge my car, which is as far as you can drive in Ireland, even further than Donegal. The infrastructure, and the state has the responsibility to make it possible, so that yes, you put in place get the price right, but that's only the beginning. And I think that we need to focus on, and we need research in terms of retrofitting dwellings, what's going to work for people. Another area in the state which is, I think, important is getting the incentives right for the state itself. My colleagues in the SRI in 2003, Sue Scott, did an interesting study looking at energy efficiency in the university sector and the third level sector. And universities had done a reasonable job because they had a number, they would build a combined heat and power plant because they knew they could get the money back over 5 years. The ITs were useless, not because they were useless, but because the department said, unless you can get the money back and within 1 year, you can't do it. So that level of control, and actually the headmaster in my, who died unfortunately in the last 6 months, the school that my children went to in 20 years ago, he knew I was interested in this, he sent me his electricity bills for the school, and he showed he'd managed to halve the bills, but the point for him was he managed to hide the money from the Department of Education, and he was a woodwork teacher, and he used the money to make furniture for the school which he couldn't afford to buy. So
it's a good job. He's no longer here.
So the state has a role, and getting the incentives even for the state right is important.
Okay.
In a role where it doesn't push people into behaviour maybe that they shouldn't be.
Which covers not mentioning people who aren't here to defend themselves.
Yes, I think that's one way of protecting yourself. Deputy Heydon, thank you.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks all of the officials for coming in. I'm really disappointed, actually, that Deputy Cowen has had to leave because in his broad political point-scoring contribution where he didn't actually ask any questions, I was struck by the fact that different people can look at the same plan and see different things. Deputy Cowen saw, I think his quote was, a political reaction to recent elections, while Friends of the Irish Environment have called it the biggest innovation in climate policy in 20 years. So, you know, who are you going to believe? But I was struck actually by the point that was made earlier that one of the reasons we're close to our 2020 targets, reaching them, was because there was a recession between when they were set in 2005 and now. So I suppose Fianna Fáil's contribution to climate change was to crash the economy, quadruple the national debt and cause a recession. And just as Fine Gael fixed the massive job losses of that recession, going from 16% to 5% through the Action Plan for Jobs, that's exactly the approach that Minister Richard Bruton now plans to take in a detailed way through this plan with 183 actions and quarterly reporting and all the rest. But anyway, I'll move on to the few questions I have that I won't duplicate questions that were asked earlier, but we have a generous regime of taxation incentives to promote the uptake of electric vehicles and VRT relief BIK regime and that. Would the witnesses here today see this as a set about right, or need to be looked at in terms of the rates for the likes of the taxation incentives around EVs and that? And in relation to VRT and motor tax on private cars, which has been calculated on the basis of CO2 emissions, higher emissions attracting a higher tax liability, how would you suggest that should be changed to better impact climate action into the future? Thanks, sir.
Maybe I'll just kick off and on the incentives, personally I've done some work on, as I've mentioned already, on the SEI grant scheme, and one of the conclusions in our research reports on that the grant scheme should in essence be changed. We provide grants at present for retrofits on the inputs, for the stuff we buy and put into the house, and not the outcomes. So in a sense, the grant should be switched over to you get a grant for how much energy savings or emission savings you get, not how much stuff you buy. And that refers back again to my comments earlier that people not with the best advice or doing the best they could, but they were changing the windows when maybe they should have been changing or upgrading the envelope and such like. But if you were getting the grant based on what the outcome, the improvement would be, you would force yourself to make sure you didn't make a mistake and that you went and got independent advice and hopefully that outcome. So that was, I suppose, one of the, are the incentives right? That's one area where I think we could do better.
On the incentives, I think that they're probably broadly appropriate for today. What is affecting take-up is our electric cars, will they have the range and are they cheaper? And the price is falling all of the time and the range is improving, and then will the infrastructure be there to make it work? So I think the incentives are right. More incentives, if you have more incentives, but the car can't be charged, you're going nowhere. So I think the next priority is getting the infrastructure rolled out.
Yes.
So I suppose in terms of the incentives, we would consider the incentives for electric vehicles at the moment to be quite generous. We have over the last couple of years, as opposed to looking at the generosity of them, broadening them. So for instance, you now get 50% discount on tolls for battery electric vehicles. There's incentives for taxis. But I suppose the other key thing is we've introduced a grant for home charging. And we've also, the plan sets out the need to support local authorities for on-street charging. And the Climate Action Fund has, or is supporting rapid charging or fast charging. So I suppose it might be more over the next number of years, the focus really shifting towards that infrastructure as opposed to the vehicles. But what Professor Fitzgerald said, I would echo, there is what we control and what we can't control. And in terms of the supply of vehicles, both the price point and the range, we can't necessarily control that. I think the good news is we are seeing longer range vehicles and we are seeing the prices come down. So I suppose all the things coming together are very positive, but we absolutely accept that the infrastructure is a key priority for us.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, I have an indication from Deputy Chambers again.
Yeah, just a few final questions, and Deputy Heydon, I'll make sure to relay your comments to Deputy Cowen, who's not
Email
here.
it, so you can pass it on.
It is a little bit comical to say that it was broad political point scoring in the same breath as the point scoring you engaged in yourself, but in any event.
Just retorting.
If I may just go to the department just once more, Mr. Maughan and your colleagues there. How much of the plan, or what percentage of the plan, do you envisage will be paid for through non-exchequer funding?
So I think the point's already been made in response to questions that a lot of the investments that will have to take place over the next decade will actually be private sector investments. So be that sort of retrofitting, be that sort of vehicle purchasing. These are, hundreds and thousands of consumer decisions which the plan, through its various actions, are going to try to influence over the coming decade. The broad balance between exchequer and private investment is, as I said earlier, a question for design, for policy design. So to come back to the previous exchange of questions around the EV incentives, there is a very broad set of incentives which, the view is are currently appropriately structured for where things are in terms of the prices of electric vehicles. As the prices of those vehicles changes and comes down over time, the way in which the exchequer intervenes may change over time as well, as my colleague has already mentioned. So that balance between the exchequer component of the intervention and the private component of the intervention does have to be carefully managed over the coming decade and again further into the future to make sure that we're actually getting the targets we want to achieve through the plan. So it's not a matter of saying right now for the next 11 years this will be the balance, X% this and X% that. That will adjust necessarily over time.
So, have you any plans to actually cost the plan? And if so, when will we see the costings?
I think again I'll come back to to my comment earlier.
Maybe just the first part of the question. Are there any plans currently to actually cost the plan?
To answer the question, the way in which the plan will be costed will be done through an annual process, through the estimates process effectively. So departments in the normal course to meet the targets that are actually assigned to them through the plan will be expected to come forward with their their bids through the budgetary and estimates process for what they think they will need to deliver their targets. And again, that comes back to how they design the policies. So you will see through...
Just to be clear, each department will have certain tasks assigned to it from this plan, and on an annual basis they will have to cost it in each department.
Correct.
And then submit that to DPER on an annual basis and seek funding. And I assume hope that they are successful in that bid for funding.
Correct. So that's the point that I suppose that's been broadly made already and by ministers yesterday, is that sort of this is all within the framework of the existing exchequer resources that are available.
Very good. And in terms of the quarterly update, on what date can we expect our first quarterly update?
My understanding, and again this is subject to the Minister, how he proposes to do it, my understanding is that the first quarterly update will be for Q3 2019 actions.
In terms of the EU fines, we've touched upon the emissions targets. What are the fines that we are facing into for 2020 for our renewables targets?
That's effectively been answered, I thought, rather comprehensively, but briefly, please.
Yeah, so again, I suppose just the term fines, it would be a statistical transfer purchase from another country. We don't know, are the estimates we have are what I described earlier, based on the trades that have been done. We're at a level of about 20 to 25 million per percentage point, which the latest estimates has Ireland dropping 3 percentage points short. So that would be a range of around 60 to 75 million. But again, I will stress that's an estimate based on a trade made between two other countries, and we can't know until any such trade is negotiated and agreed what that cost would be. So very much just for indicative purposes.
I'm entitled to ask the question. Even if it was asked by somebody else, I'm entitled to ask the question to seek clarification on it. And it's not really for you to adjudicate, Chair. With respect.
Well, I'm sorry, Deputy, with respect to you, I have made it clear on a number of occasions in the past, as is practice in a number of committees, if a question has been asked and answered by somebody, they do not have to repeat the entire answer. They can do just as they've done, give a clarification if there's something missing. But if deputies really shouldn't be asking a question which has been fully answered again, not fully answered. But
with respect, Chair, you did interject before the answer was given, so you couldn't have known what the clarification was going to be. So that's my interpretation of it, Chair.
Go ahead, Deputy.
Just some further questions then to Mr Fitzgerald and Mr Broughan or either of your colleagues. In terms of the whole agriculture debate, which we've been having in this committee as well and outside of here, on one hand we are very efficient agricultural producers, and we are an agricultural country, so it makes sense that we would have higher agricultural emissions than a country that's not a highly agricultural country. So one of the arguments being put forward is that if we reduce our agricultural production in this country, the food has to be produced somewhere else, maybe less efficiently. So what are your views on that argument? Also in terms of the extraction of fuels, so oil and gas, again, the counter-argument to that and one of the issues is energy security for the country. And if we are still reliant on fuels to keep the lights on effectively, what is your view on maybe becoming reliant on another country to provide that and having to import it, which generates more emissions because you're having to get the fuel to travel here? So have you any views on those two hot topics?
On agriculture, I decided not to, given the focus of this committee, not to focus on agriculture. In our annual review report to be published next month, we have a special chapter and we are concentrating on agriculture. And briefly, Teagasc could put forward a range of measures. We also think that you could increase farm incomes and increase the security of farm incomes if people producing cattle use the land in other ways. That at the moment the agricultural price, their farmers, the beef price in the EU is about 30% above non-EU. They're highly vulnerable to what happens in Brexit. The numbers are already falling, so that a reduction in cattle numbers would be part of it, but we will go into detail on that next month. And on the security, as answered to Deputy Doherty, on oil, I don't think there's a security argument for pumping more oil offshore. There could be on gas, but I would want to look at that because I'm not sure you can segment the two.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Deputy Doherty.
Yes, just a number of questions. In relation to the plan, it has bringing diesel into line with the cost of petrol. I just can't find it here in the report. Is there a time frame for that? And can I ask maybe the panel's view in relation to the fuel rebate scheme for the haulage industry in the context of that? Do they believe that it should continue, or that it would need to be modified and increased to support the haulage sector? That's the first question.
Deputy, just to respond on the question, just to help you, it's on page 40 of the plan. There's a series of proposals that are set out in relation to what types of issues will be examined through the normal tax strategy group process, one of which is the question about gradually equalising diesel and petrol excise rates. As you probably know, this has been looked at by the tax strategy group for the last number of years. It's almost a standing issue on the agenda of the group. It is subject to political decision, as you know, in each year's budget. It does have to be seen, I think, also in the context of the wider issue about sort of rebalancing away from rebalancing of the entire taxation regime to, I suppose, to seek to promote electric vehicles as against either petrol or diesel. So that, you know, each of these, I suppose, proposals or each of these issues can't be taken in isolation. I suppose the issue for the Department of Finance will be to sort of find the best balance which addresses the issue about revenue protection, which I think was addressed earlier, but also addresses the objectives that we're trying to achieve through the plan, which is to promote behaviour and investment decisions in the right direction from a climate point of view.
Just the key question here was in relation to the diesel rebate, which is a very important discussion that's taken place, particularly within the haulage sector, and was in the run-up to the last budget, because there was either an anticipation of equalisation of diesel or diesel and petrol, or an anticipation of carbon, or indeed both, increasing carbon, which would have had an impact on the haulage sector. And the question is should the diesel rebate continue, or and in your view, would it need to be modified, increased to support the fleet?
We don't have a particular...
Is that not a policy?
We don't have a particular view as a department on that proposal. It is a matter for the department and the Minister for Finance.
Okay. Has anybody else? Like, this is, in fairness, Chair, this is a climate change policy. This is about trying to move people from...
But sorry, there were very strict guidelines. There's nothing to prevent either Professor Fitzgerald or the ESRI commenting on it. But my understanding, under the rules of which a committee operates, departmental officials don't comment on policy. They don't advocate or comment on policy. They inform us of positions that are policy. That's my understanding of the rules. That's the only reason that there's absolutely no problem at all with other witnesses commenting on it.
That's something that we've also been looking at. How can you compensate the haulage sector without getting rid of the incentive to decarbonise? So the problem with the diesel rebate scheme is that you get money back when you spend it on diesel. So it has the opposite effect of the carbon tax. So what we investigated is instead of increasing that, to rather give a production tax reduction to the haulage sector to compensate for this increased carbon tax. And we see that if you do that, you can still get emission reductions in the sector, but you can also compensate them for the carbon tax losses. So, I mean, as has been pointed out, this is a policy question, but I think it's important when looking at this problem to still keep in mind that we want to reduce emissions with this increased carbon tax, and compensating the haulage sector should not compensate that, if possible.
It goes to the issue of, you know, polluter praise as well, but is there an alternative there at this point in time for a truck to take? You know, is there there's new standards, and the vehicles are moving to those new standards, but there's no electric-powered vehicles that can take goods from here to France and back again, as far as I'm aware.
There may not be electric, but Gas Networks Ireland are promoting gas-fueled, but you still need an infrastructure out there for refuelling. Yeah. So, but like I think in the your question was as the, you know, looking at a climate policy in the longer term. In the short term, most truckers will not have the alternative, so they will be forced. Yeah. But in the longer term, if they are going to look for that gas, which could be biogas in the future, in a sense, they will have to face the incentive of a higher carbon or higher fuel price. That might force them to look for more fuel efficient or carbon efficient vehicles. Yeah. But in the short term, you're right, there are no real alternative to them.
Okay, can I go back to...
Just,
sorry.
Just to clarify on the compressed natural gas, so I suppose, there are a network of 14 stations, 14 publicly accessible compressed natural gas stations that are being rolled out. The first one's open in Dublin Port already, and that does provide an option for HGV drivers. So there is a network of 14 stations committed to being rolled out by Gas Networks Ireland. The other point that Mr. Curtis alluded to was it does provide, even though gas is a fossil fuel, it provides the future for biogas to be produced from anaerobic digestion, so food and agriculture waste injected into the grid and then used in the trucks. And it is, in many ways, like the biofuels obligation that we have already for petrol could potentially be funded through that. And it's set out in the plan. We'll be consulting on that in the third quarter.
In relation to the targets for electric vehicles, so there's kind of two parts to this here. There's 500,000 cars, which is the target for 2030, and then the rest of them are hybrids. So the rest of them would still be using a version of fossil fuels plus electrical charge. So it's not necessarily the €1 million vehicle headlines that we're all hearing. It's 500,000 is the target of electric cars on the roads by 2030, and then hybrids that would make up the rest.
So I think there's an important distinction to make, just so we're all fully. So there's pure battery electric vehicles which can only be fueled through plugging in. There is plug-in hybrid electric vehicles which have both an engine and a battery, and you can actually run them as full zero-emission vehicles if you charge them every night, etc. And then there's hybrid electric, and that would be, Toyota would be quite a common hybrid electric vehicle. So there's more hybrid electric vehicles now than most other vehicles. The targets in the plan are, when the term electric vehicle is used, I understand it means battery electric and plug-in hybrid electric. So all these electric vehicles are...
So no fossil fuel component?
Well, you see, in plug-in hybrid, it depends on driver behaviour. So the logic of a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle is people want to drive electric and commute in and out to work every day, and they can use it in electric mode. But once a month or once a week, they want to drive a longer distance.
But those ranges are like 30, 40 kilometre, aren't they?
They are increasing, but they are lower, yes.
Yeah. But so anybody going here to Monaghan, they're using fossil fuels.
So you'd need a full battery electric, or if you use...
No, it was just clarification, because the key question is, and it was Dr. Fitzgerald that talked about incentives. We've advocated that we need to increase incentives here. Look, what do we have? About 4,000 electric cars, or thereabouts on the roads at this point in time. See, the reality is there are a lot of people out there who want to do the right thing. And there are those challenges, as you said, in terms of the infrastructure, uncertainty and all the rest. But even despite those challenges, people are still purchasing and investing and all the rest. And not everybody's doing big, long commutes and so on and so forth. But these cars are beyond the means of a lot of people who want to do the right thing. You mentioned that the incentives you believe are appropriately priced. Given the target which we need to get to within a 10-year period, would it not be appropriate to be increasing the bands that are available? Like the bands under SEI, what is it, 6,000 is at the upper limit? 5,000, is it? 5,000 at the upper limit for a car. And a lot of people are looking, because the technology is changing, the ranges thing, and a lot of people are worried if I buy this year, next year they will have more range and so on and so forth. But £5,000 for a car that's costing you, 35, 40,000 euro at the for the larger ranges isn't a huge support.
I can only say in my choice, although it was 3 years ago, I went for a hybrid when I looked at the electric cars, and my next one will definitely be electric, because I hope the hybrid will last. But the technology is changing so rapidly that my judgment would be, and this is not something the Council has considered, my judgment would be you keep the incentives where they are, and within 2 or 3 years it will become the cheaper option for people. The other concern I have is that if you increase the incentives where there's problems getting the car... Can
I just make the point there? It will be maybe the cheaper option for people who are buying new, but there's a large cohort of people, the majority of people, who will never be able to buy a new car, who've never bought a new car because they can't afford a new car, so they'll always buy second-hand. And then you've got issues in terms of the electric vehicle that are being sold on and the supports that would be available to that. So I'm focused really on people who want to do the right thing but won't.
I think you have raised an issue which needs further research. As I know it's a very real issue. I see I've always bought second-hand cars myself, so I can see that in terms of speed of adoption on second-hand cars, that it would be interesting to see, could we speed that up in some way? The other issue is, if you increase the incentives now, it is difficult to lay your hands on one or two of the models that are popular in terms of electric cars. And if you raise the incentive and the supply is fixed, the money will go to either the distributor or the manufacturer. And this is going to be an issue at a European level. Will the ramping up of the production of electric cars happen sufficiently rapidly, or will they just increase the margin on it? So I'd be nervous about increasing the incentives at the moment for that reason. But the issue which you raise on second-hand cars is an interesting issue, and I think it bears further consideration.
My last 2 points in this.
No, sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Just a very quick couple of points on it. So when we take the battery and the plug-in hybrids, there's now over 11,000 on Irish roads. Just to give an indication, so far this year we've had just over 2,600 new, but also about 1,200 used imported electric vehicles licensed in the country. And in terms of absolutely, there's a €5,000 for private purchases of new vehicles, but there's also a €5,000 VRT relief, and that applies to both new and second-hand imports. So the fleet is growing both through new cars in Ireland and second-hand imports. But again, those are battery and plug-in hybrids.
Making people want to do the right thing, but for a lot of people, it's still tiny compared to 2.7 million vehicles on our roads or something like that. It's still a small fraction, and I know it's going in the right direction, but there is additional incentives for people who will only buy second-hand because they can never afford the 20 or 22,000 euro for a new car anyway at the lower end, never mind the higher cost now of an electric vehicle, even with the 5,000.
And I suppose this is anecdotal, but what we are hearing, talking to the motor industry, etc., is there are supply constraints in terms of these vehicles. So in terms of, it's not clear that in the short term additional incentives would lead to a significant uptake. So there could be an element of deadweight loss in that, in terms of there are waiting lists for these cars, and in many ways different countries are competing for the limited supply of worldwide electric vehicle production. So I suppose it is really around that middle part of the next decade, when price parity, increased range and increased supply is viewed as being I suppose the key point of inflection.
Okay, I want to make a general point, and then just the last question. The general point is the point about the comments that were made in my absence, but I was listening, which was, a lot of this is going to come from private sector involvement and investment, and that's fine. That'll be, individuals, loans, and so on and so forth. But the absence here, and this is why this document doesn't have any costings. The absence here is because of this concept of a new Green Deal. The state actually saying we are in a situation of emergency. A lot of talk of what will happen if we miss our 2020 targets, but we know it's 1.7 billion if we miss our 2030 targets. At current levels, those levels are likely, the cost of these credits are likely to increase. So, and that's putting a financial figure on it as opposed to the cost to the environment, the cost to our planet. So what is missing here is the ambition from the state to say, yes, we have an issue, so therefore we will roll out retrofitting for every public authority house. What is missing here is real public transport. I can't get the train to Donegal, from Donegal to Dublin, because the last time the train ran into Donegal was 1963. Try talking about public transport. If it wasn't for private operators there, we wouldn't be able to get from A to B unless you've got the reliance of a car. So there are real challenges that aren't laid out in this plan in terms of and the fact that there is no costing, and we're going to leave it for every year for a department to put forward their process and the estimates, it's not the right way to do it. We should put a cost in this here. We should acknowledge the size and scale of this problem. Well, that was my comment. The question, and the last question I have here, is in relation to carbon taxes. Mr. Fitzgerald, I understand, and I address this to yourself, I understand the issue of taxes. One, to raise revenue, the other to change behaviour. If you want to do the behaviour, you need to also have the option, like that's why we argued for the sugar-sweetened drinks, and we argued for it at a level that would change behaviour. So I've got a number of questions. One is, the trajectory set out in relation to this report is that carbon taxes would increase to €80 per tonne over a 10-year period. That would allow for a €6 increase per annum. In your view, you have called for a €15 increase this year. In your view, do you need to have sharp rises to actually change behaviour? The second point is the €20 per tonne already brings in something like €486 million. Is that money in the pot to be redistributed out to those who want to, under the hypothecation model, to invest themselves or to help those who are on low income, as the ESRI has pointed out? And thirdly, because I've subscribed to many of the points that have been raised by Deputy Barrett, there is an issue here of justice. And people need to buy into not only this part, but every part of the plan and other plans. Because we have proposals here like Powering Ireland 2030. It's far more ambitious than what the government has in terms of renewable energy. It's 80% compared to 70%. There's other proposals that need to feed into this mix. But in terms of carbon taxes, where is the taxes, the equivalent taxes on the big polluters, on the industry? And the last question I have, particularly for Mr Fitzgerald, is in relation to, if you can explain to me how Sweden, for example, who has the highest carbon tax in the world at €120 per tonne and has introduced that since, 1991, only has 0.6% of electric vehicles on their roads. And while there's a lot of renewable energy, most of that is hydro and has been there for decades. There's a huge reliance, I think, in about 40% on nuclear energy. But the question is if we want to move people to, or as the government says, nudge people along the road, how come high carbon taxes hasn't resulted in more electric vehicles on our roads in Sweden, for example?
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Trajectory. This is, I think, for you, the Oireachtas committee, to determine. We will suggest €35 a tonne to suggest the urgency that we've missed out. However, it may well be that sharp rises would be less acceptable, and providing there is a trajectory laid out by the Oireachtas for the future. If it was €6 a tonne every year, and that was agreed by the Oireachtas, giving a reasonable certainty that it will happen in the future, that's fine. So I think it's the trajectory over time is important rather than the precise number. The your second point was €400 in.
The million that's brought in on the.
The hypothecation. I think it probably would be a good idea to put it all together rather than say it's the increase. That's too complicated to explain to people. If I was doing it, if I was the minister, I would say it's going to be the full amount of revenue, and I will attribute some of the increase in social welfare to it, or I'd handle it in that way. It might be seen to be rather. That's an issue in term, I think, for the political system rather than, certainly not for the council, but I think that could be a good option. Industry is important. If you look in Ireland, 8% of emissions comes from manufacturing. And if you add in the electricity they consume, it takes you to about 15%. So this issue of, tax the industry, actually 85% of the emissions, 30% or a third comes from agriculture, is at 15% from households. The bulk of transport comes from households. So yes, the majority, we've got to change. If we're going to change, it's got to be we, the people of Ireland. However, in terms of industry, we, the Council, have been concerned about the incentives for industry, that the bulk of the industrial emissions are handled within the EU ETS scheme. The EU ETS scheme has produced a price that is too low. And we have recommended, the French government proposed introducing a carbon price floor which would guarantee you a high and rising price in the absence of the EU ETS scheme working. They invited the Dutch and the British governments, interestingly, last year was, because the British are the leaders in this, the British have already done it, to join a coalition in northwestern Europe with Germany in doing it. We advocated the Irish government join with this potential coalition. It's unlikely to happen unless the German government buy into it. If they did, and we published research in November on why it would be a good idea, we think that actually it would drive out coal, not just here, we're going to close it anyway, but in northwestern Europe. It is already closing coal in Britain. So I think also in terms of the EU ETS scheme, it would be better if that was made work better than it is doing at present, because for the rest of industry which is covered by it, the incentives aren't high enough to make them change. So the problem is that that is not something that is really within the Irish government's remit, but the Irish government, in terms of, and I think they have been at a European level, advocating a much tighter approach at European level. But there is a problem. The Polish government are totally opposed to it because of coal mining in Poland. The German government have so far not bought into the French idea on a carbon price floor. However, the recent election and the changes in the political composition in Germany could see a change. If they did, we should, Ireland, join in this coalition, which would raise the price of electricity. And the modelling which we've done, it wouldn't be a dramatic effect on consumers, but it would affect the industrial sector. So yes, the industrial sector, big firms are not paying enough. The price should rise. There's a mechanism there to raise it for some of them, but it's up to the EU ETS to raise it for all of them. But even if that happened, the vast bulk of emissions are the responsibility of the people of Ireland, farmers, households and so on. Sweden, I don't know the answer on electric cars in Sweden, but even with a high carbon price, the price of cars is coming down so rapidly, it still isn't yet time, even in Sweden. However, Sweden is interesting. It's nuclear power in Sweden. Sweden has a combination of nuclear power, and for 20 years it's been fully integrated with Norway. And then Jutland, the main part of Denmark, has also been. One of the reasons why Denmark has been able to have so much wind is they're fully interconnected with Norway. And if the wind drops 5 seconds in Denmark, 5 seconds later they let water out of a dam in Norway. So Scandinavia, because they have a lot of hydro and an integrated system, can actually make much better use of the energy and deploy more renewables. In the case of Ireland, in government moving to 70% as the target for renewable electricity by 2030, I think we're going to need they're hopefully planning on building an interconnector to France, but that may not be enough. The research done previously on this suggested we would need a lot more interconnection with continental Europe. It would be cheaper to interconnect with the UK, but for obvious reasons they're not the most reliable partner at the moment. The interconnection to France, because the tradition in Europe is that the costs of interconnection are shared between the two parties. In our interconnection, both Northern Ireland's and the Republic's connection with the United Kingdom, or with Great Britain, as is Northern Ireland, our Irish consumers have paid, British consumers paid nothing. So if we do a deal with France, if the French contribute to it, and if the EU would contribute, it may actually be.
If you have an insight as to how Sweden, with the highest carbon taxes in the world.
That you need to understand, the first thing you need to understand is that there are a lot of exemptions in the Swedish carbon tax. I'm not talking about private consumers, but in the industry. Secondly, ethanol is extremely popular in private vehicles in Sweden. So I think that's one of the contributors to the slower uptake than you would have expected. Secondly, the distances that Swedish people drive on average is much higher than, say, in a smaller country here as Ireland. So I think that the uptake in recent years has increased tremendously in Sweden because, firstly, the ranges of the electric vehicles have become better. So I think that if you're looking at the EV uptake in Sweden compared to the carbon tax, I think that you should look at the last recent years where the uptake has been much higher. And I think that the reason for this delay is because people were using ethanol vehicles in the interim.
Okay. I'm going to allow Deputy Boyd Barrett. come back in now.
First of all, on the carbon, the purchase of the carbon credits to deal with the fact that we're overshooting our targets. I mean, isn't it a fair comment to say, because I think a lot of these discussions need to be translated into language that ordinary people understand, isn't it fair to say what we're actually doing is paying for the right to pollute much more than we are supposed to be polluting? And in that sense, paying for carbon credits to deal with our failure to meet targets is actually retarding the global effort to reduce emissions. I mean, isn't that a reasonable description of what we're doing? And in that sense, it's pretty shameful from a global, addressing climate change point of view. And I'm also curious about the government's. Now, I suppose this is a government decision, so maybe there's not much you can say about it. Maybe the ESRI could say more, but I'm just shocked at the line. I had to run over to the Dáil just to repeat this point to the Taoiseach. The bill, People Before Profits, Climate Emergency Measures Bill, which seeks to keep fossil fuels in the ground, which is the scientists are saying 80% of known reserves have to stay in the ground if we're going to address the climate emergency. Known reserves, never mind exploring for more. And they don't limit it, by the way, to oil. They say fossil fuel reserves. Known fossil fuels, 80% of stay in the ground. The logic of that is you don't go looking for more, you don't facilitate looking for more. And the response of the Taoiseach in opposing our bill is to say, oh, this won't make any difference to emissions. Now, I mean, to me, this is just a bizarre statement, because the scientists are saying what I've just said. I won't repeat it. And the Taoiseach says it won't make any difference to emissions if we keep fossil fuels in the ground. Now, they can't both be right. And to me, it's just obvious, is it not? And maybe the ERSI would comment on this. If we allow the exploration of fossil fuels, and they are found, then more fossil fuels will be burnt, more will go into the environment, and it will do more damage. And it doesn't really matter whether they're much, at least, whether they're gas or oil. And particularly, by the way, I would question the gas as a transitionary fuel. I mean, fracked gas also, in the process, there's a lot of methane given off, and when you take it in the round, gas, I would argue, certainly fracked gas, is as damaging to the atmosphere and to efforts to deal with climate change as oil. And surely paying for and establishing the infrastructure to facilitate gas as a so-called transition is actually investment that could be going elsewhere. There's an opportunity cost, is that what you call it? If you're investing in the infrastructure to bring in gas, you're not investing in our universities to develop renewable energies, for example. One comes at the expense of the other. Yeah, well, those are questions, very clear questions, Colm.
Maybe I'll start off on the frack gas. I'm not sure if you said it, but it's clearly a fossil gas. It's not a transition gas or a transition fuel in its own right. But I think the idea of gas being a transition fuel is the idea that we can use as a comparison to people using oil or coal, which have higher emissions. If you switch to gas, you're still on a fossil fuel, but you're producing less emissions. But in the longer term, as my colleagues in the department said, that as you build biogas infrastructure, whether it's biomethane, taking waste from agriculture, food waste, and digesting them to produce biogas and upgrading it to essentially natural gas equivalent, then you have a sort of a, well, it's a net zero emission fuel. Your opening point was about the carbon tax allows you to, like, essentially you're paying to pollute. Well, I suppose prior to
carbon credits. Carbon credits, I was referring to.
Okay.
The purchase of carbon credits.
Oh yeah, I suppose, but they have a value. So if you don't have one as a company, you end up buying them. So it's giving you a permission, I suppose, to pollute in the short term. But that policy actually as Professor Fitzgerald said, hasn't been as successful, but the idea of that envelope of carbon credits has been diminishing and is further diminishing. So I think it was like our proposal for the carbon tax. It was to give a long-term sort of vision of where the credits would decline. So in the tax, you announce a series of increases in the carbon tax to allow households to adjust behaviour, and for the carbon credit bullet, carbon credits for industry, they were going to decline. So it was encouraging companies to be more less carbon intensive.
On your first question, if you pump more oil, there will be more world emissions. There won't be less. However, the emissions in Ireland will be unaffected by it. I presume that that's what the Taoiseach meant. So
it's disingenuous, though, isn't it? Let's be honest.
Well, I've given you my answer, which is on the second issue, which was on the gas issue. The thing about gas, if you look at the most sophisticated work done on how to get to zero net emissions by 2050, it's the United Kingdom and Denmark, of the ones that I've looked at, are the most sophisticated. And the UK say they will not, they are upping the ante and saying they're going to reach net zero by 2050, but that will involve gas-fired generation and pumping the emissions back into the ground. You wouldn't do that with oil, because you're not going to collect the emissions from the back of a lorry or the back of a car and pump it into the ground. So gas is it's a transitional fuel, but the points which you make about you don't want to invest in this because you're going to, like investing in a gas boiler, if actually the transition, you should be investing in a heat pump. That's not the way to go. That's a waste of money. But in terms of electricity generation, it may well be that we will have significant gas-fired generation still in 2050, but net zero emissions by pumping the gas back into the ground. So some gas may well be a part of the solution.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Could I just follow up on that, team there? So, and first of all, because I haven't had an opportunity to do so, my apologies. Unfortunately, I had a clashing engagement at the start of the committee today, which is why I couldn't be present. So I know, and my thanks to Deputy Lahart, who stood in to chair the opening part of the committee. Just though to follow up on that, if the logic of what you're saying there, Professor Fitzgerald, is that gas, natural gas, and the use of it in years to come through repumping the emissions back into then there is obviously a benefit to the country in having a natural gas supply if we're using that, and we can capture those emissions through the process you've outlined. There would obviously be a major cost to us if we had to bring that gas from somewhere else in the world to Ireland to burn it. So effectively it is a plus game by continuing to allow that exploration for gas.
I wouldn't go that far in that the gas consumption by 2040, 2050, if we do our job on decarbonising, will be much lower than it is today. Now, as John is the expert in this, there will be more biogas, so some of it will actually be renewable in that sense, but still the amount of gas involved would not be, it is going to be much less than we're talking about today. With a European market where you have a lot of different sources, we would get it at a rather similar price by importing. But having the security supply being issues in having our own source would be beneficial if you're going to be continuing to consume gas, but you're not talking about you're talking about probably less gas than we're using today. So yes, there is an advantage, but in terms of the overall benefits of spending a lot of money and going looking for it off the west coast, I'd want to consider that.
But in terms of even the most sophisticated model you've mentioned, which is the UK model, that is built into their thinking on that.
Yes. They cannot see in the light of the available technologies, how you can get zero emissions in electricity without having some flexible energy source, such as gas, which can fill in for gaps.
And is that a reasonable assumption, effectively, therefore, for Ireland as well?
Yes, on the basis of known technologies today, like, we would be anxious for the department to lay out the trajectories to 2050, to do what the British have done, to do what the Danes have done. It is highly likely that if you do so, and the work done by University College Cork on this, that is a significant part of the solution to getting to 2050 will be gas-fired. Like, if you get to 70% renewables, you're still going to need 30%, and gas, where you pump the emissions back into the ground, it'll be expensive to do so. But there's research being done on this, because we do have an empty Kinsale oil field and a pipe that goes out to it, so that the possibilities of doing so are there. But I think this is work in progress in terms of research, but I think it's highly likely, on the basis of current known technologies, that part of our solution will be a limited amount of electricity from gas with carbon capture and storage.
Okay.
If I might just quickly add on that, and you say the benefits of the gas system, I think the Climate Action Plan possibly has a measure in about no new gas boilers or oil boilers in new houses. But if you think of, I think gas networks have about 600,000 households on their network. So in a sense, if you want all those households to put in heat pumps, you have to get 600,000 decisions of individual houses to upgrade. But if you can switch the natural gas over to biogas, now we may not have the capacity for 100% substitution out of natural gas, but essentially it's a corporate decision by Ireland Inc. to produce more biogas, put it into the network. You do not need to have all those 600,000 households make that active decision and put their hand in their pocket, because suddenly you're having a lower, if it was entirely biogas, it'd be zero emissions. But I think it's too ambitious at this stage to talk about we haven't the capacity in terms of wastes, anaerobic digestion and all the feedstocks to go to 100% biogas in the future, but there's opportunity there. Like, we have a lot of households, like we've spoken here about EVs and retrofits and all these kind of things. In much, it's individual houses have to make all these things together. There are a lot of decisions, it's up in the millions of individual decisions. So that's one where corporately you can hopefully make a decision that might get rid of several 100,000 individual decisions by households. A long-winded.
Just though, in relation to that, are you saying then that if you could foresee a situation where you could switch from natural gas to biogas, that the pressure on households to make that change would be mitigated or would be offset? Or?
Well, I'm trying to, in a sense, if we were trying to reduce emissions from households, if households are using zero net emissions fuels, as in biogas, then yes. But there's always a benefit then from actually, if they improve the efficiency of their house, they will be using less of that biogas, so it could go further. But I think, and maybe some from the department could say, but I think SEAI have done some assessments of the potential sources of or feedstocks that are available to produce biogas. It could be in the range of, 15 or 25%. It's not an entirety, but there's a lot of work going on, particularly down in UCC, trying to look at opportunities to produce biogas, whether it's from algae or the sea or on source, like woody biomass. But actually a big opportunity, and we spoke briefly about agriculture, and yes, we may produce low intensity beef, carbon intensity beef and milk, but over half the beef sector is unprofitable. So we may be producing low intensity beef, but farmers are not making money out of it. But the grass they produce to help grow cattle could potentially be a feedstock also to produce biogas.
Okay, thank you. So yes.
Yeah, so I suppose just to talk a bit more about the biogas, so I suppose the basic feedstocks would be food waste, so and that would include brown bins, etc., but also in terms of agricultural waste, so slurries. But in terms of how that gas would go into the network and who would pay for it, I suppose there is a cost differential. So producing biogas is more expensive than fossil fuel gas at the moment. And that's set out in the plan that we want to set a target for it. We haven't set a specific target because there's more work to do on it. But in terms of it is looking at how that could be funded. And there's a number of different ways. One would be, for instance, an exchequer fund for injection into the gas grid. Another would be similar to the renewable electricity, some sort of PSO. And another one, quite an interesting one, would be similar to the biofuels obligation scheme. So even though we all fill up cars with fossil fuel at the moment, we're not selecting a biofuel handle or a fossil fuel handle. There's around about 5% of the fuel in both petrol and diesel is biofuel, and it's placed as an obligation on the suppliers. So it kind of takes away the point Mr. Curtis was making about this consumer choice. So we're not asking drivers to pick the biofuel or the fossil fuel handle. It's an obligation on fuel suppliers. So in terms of how biogas, and it has been successful in a number of other countries, but how we would support it and increase that biogas into the network. In terms of the level that could be, I mean, there are, in the draft National Energy and Climate Plan, a level of around 3% of the heat usage in the country was flagged. Gas Networks Ireland are talking about 20, 30%, these sort of levels. So there is a lot of potential, and Ireland has one of the highest potentials because of our agricultural sector in particular for biogas. But again, it's how we would fund this and how we would put it through that work needs to be done over the next period.
Okay, thank you very much. I just need to let Deputy Stanley in.
Thanks for your indulgence, Claire. Just as being Vice Chair of the Climate Committee, I have obviously an interest in this today, and thanks for the opportunity to let me in. Just in relation to the biogas, I published a paper nearly 2 years ago now on biogas, and we looked at what was happening in other countries, and I suppose the whole need for climate action was the main driver in doing it. But the other thing I suppose that was in my mind is that we have a huge agricultural sector, and that's as it is. We're an agricultural country. That's fine and dandy, but we have a huge issue with agricultural waste, and we're not long back from the EU again after pleading for another derogation on slurry spreading, because we are churning it out by the megaton, right? And it's having other environmental consequences in terms of rivers and water quality, etc. Now, and what I wanted to ask, and maybe Professor Fitzgerald might deal with this one, is in relation to we have only one plant in the state that's injecting biogas into the grid. As far as I know, it has started recently. It was just about to do it the last time I visited the plant, which is over a year ago, and that's pumped it into the town of Athy. The injection point is at the Cush, where the Cush Inn used to be, in Kildangan. And on the one hand, we have this huge problem of agricultural waste, and we have a substantial beef industry, and there's a huge amount of waste around that. We have a substantial hospitality industry, which means we have a huge amount of food waste. And at the plant in Nurney, if you stand at it and see what's going in, that's what's going in, that's all that stuff. A lot of odours because there's a pig farm in it, but the plant itself doesn't have a lot of odours. There's over 6,000 of those in Germany, and we're not Germany, but we are a big agricultural producer for our size. And in terms of, I published a paper as well, Power in Ireland 2030. Our party done that, Sinn Féin done that last year. We tried to get the media to take some interest in it, but we were unsuccessful with that one, I'm afraid. There was something else more important on the day. We set out that we believe that 10% of our energy needs could come from biogas. Now, I heard you saying 20%, and that's probably possible over a longer term. But in terms of gearing up that industry here, what is the single? Because we also have the problem with farm incomes, and I know that in Northern Italy, the farmer will have a milk income or they'll have a beef income, but they also have an income from the slurry, because they're joined together in cooperatives and the slurry is being dried. And rather than having huge tank loads of wet slurry going out, and anybody who knows anything about farming will know about this, and destroying land and land drainage pipes in the middle of winter, you simply spread dry slurry, dry fertiliser. So they actually use the anaerobic digestion in the plant, the process to actually dry the slurry and pellet it, and that's actually sold. So they're selling gas, they're selling fertiliser, and they continue selling their beef or dairy or whatever the case may be. So, we have a huge problem with farm incomes because, unless we keep subsidising, most of the farmers will go out of business and they can't survive without a single farm payment and all of the other range of subsidies that are there at the moment. So the question I'm asking is that what is the fastest way, given those needs and given the climate emergency that we're in, what is the quickest way of putting together that, of kick-starting that industry? Just for Professor Fitzgerald, my answer to that question.
Can I ask for two quickish answers?
Yeah, yes.
And sorry, Deputy Broughan, who's just joined us, I'm very sorry on this. We were just about to come to a conclusion. Otherwise, we'll actually have to take a formal break because this meeting has been running for 3 hours straight, and it's obviously.
I know you probably asked the questions I intended to ask anyway.
Okay, well that's fair enough. You're very kind, Deputy Broughan. I'll let our witnesses in there with a couple of short answers to this.
I defer to.
Best compliment I've ever received. I hope.
He's the expert, actually.
I suppose it's a couple. Like all you're saying is true. I think I previously worked with the EPA, and part of one of the work projects I worked on there was try to encourage anaerobic digestion for all these things you just talked about, for emissions capture, for water quality improvements, to deal with waste from the food sector and all that kind of stuff. I suppose, and farming, like. The idea of the department said the cost of producing this biogas is more than at present. So if you set up a plant, the cost recovery and for profit, it is not there at present. So in a sense, there needs to be something that drives it to make it more cost competitive. One thing that will do that, obviously, as carbon tax comes along. The profitability of these plants will improve versus natural gas. But I suppose the sector itself, I mentioned just a while ago that in beef production, farmers are, like, it's a vocation in a sense. You're a beef farmer and they don't want to move away from what they do. But they're on average, beef farmers are producing beef at a loss. So I think it's a matter of trying to encourage them to diversify their activities. It's not to stop beef farming, but to move into diversification, be energy producers as well. And I suppose the skeleton in the closet, so to speak, is 30% of emissions are from agriculture. It's whether the real pinch on that sector may come as if they have to try and reduce that. But that, I think, is for another day.
We're going to let the department in on the slurry as well.
Absolutely. So, 3 quick points. The first is the support scheme for renewable heat, which opened for applications. The second phase of it earlier this month supports the use of slurry wastes or food waste in anaerobic digestion and the combustion of that gas to produce heat. So if you are a pig or poultry farmer and you have this waste that you can put in an anaerobic digester and combust that gas to use for heat in your own use, then that is supported under the support scheme for renewable heat. That's one. The second route to market is actually taking that biogas, cleaning it, upgrading it and putting it into the natural gas grid. That's what we call biomethane. And there's 2 main pathways we'd see to that. One is where it's used in transport. And similar to the biofuels obligation, and we're consulting on this in Q3, it's set out in the plan, that is where, for instance, with CNG trucks that I mentioned earlier to Deputy Doherty, CNG trucks running on biogas can essentially fulfil a requirement under the Renewable Energy Directive, and that cost is socialised across all of transport. So in many ways that is one route to market. The other is the heat sector. And I suppose the key challenge in the heat sector is the gas is more expensive than natural gas. So natural gas is maybe 2.5 cent at the wholesale rate, whereas biogas might be 3 times that. So most consumers wouldn't select to move to that. So the question is, how do we bridge that gap? And there's a question that we need to answer, which is that a role for the Exchequer, which would be a large cost over a long period? Is that something that could be fulfilled by a PSO, so similar to the electricity sector where we see PSOs on our bills, or could it be this idea of an obligation, like the biofuels obligation, but across the heat sector? So this isn't decided, but in terms of those are the different funding areas. But to be very clear, the barrier to using biomethane and injecting it into the grid is this cost differential, and in terms of determining how that cost differential would be funded. I suppose that's the key.
Thank you, and thank you to the deputies. Can I just say, you know, it's been a long, good 3-hour session. I know you fielded an awful lot of questions from an awful lot of deputies. We really do appreciate the interaction. It's part of really our work as Budget Oversight Committee and feeds into our deliberations and inputting into the budget for this year. So I would like to thank you all for coming in to us. There will be no further business. Our proceedings will conclude today, and our meeting will now stand adjourned until Wednesday, June 19th, 2019, 2 p.m. Thank you very much.